A millionaire rescued a homeless girl from the streets and left her with his sick mother. When he returned from work just hours later, he was paralyzed by what he saw. Where are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments, and if you want to know what happens next, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories like this one. Rain pelted against the windows of Garrick Thorne's car as he navigated through the deserted streets of Millfield. The rhythmic swish of windshield wipers provided the only soundtrack to his thoughts, a metronome, punctuating his exhaustion after another 14-hour shift at the architectural firm. At 34, he had mastered the art of functional solitude, successful, enough in his career to silence critics, isolated enough in his personal life to avoid complications. As he approached the town square, something caught his eye, a small figure huddled on a bench beneath the ancient oak tree. Garrick squinted through the downpour, initially convinced his tired mind was playing tricks on him. No one would be out in this weather, certainly not in the small town's deserted center at nearly midnight. But as he slowed his car, the unmistakable outline of a child came into focus. "What the hell?" he muttered, pulling over and grabbing his umbrella from the passenger seat. The cold air hit him like a physical blow as he stepped out, his dress shoes immediately soaked by a puddle. He approached cautiously, aware that his 6-foot frame might appear threatening to a child. "Hello there," he called softly over the drumming rain. "Are you okay?" The figure, a small girl no older than 7, looked up, her face pale and tear-streaked in the dim glow of the streetlights. She wore only a thin jacket over a floral dress, her dark hair plastered to her face. She didn't speak, only stared at him with eyes that seemed impossibly old for her young face. "Where are your parents?" Garrick asked, crouching down to her level, while holding the umbrella over them both. Still, she remained silent, her small hands clutching a worn backpack to her chest. "I'm Garrick." He tried again, feeling increasingly concerned about her condition. Her lips had taken on a bluish tint, and she trembled violently. "I want to help you. Can you tell me your name?" After a moment's hesitation, she whispered, "Wren." "Wren," he repeated the name, settling strangely in his chest as though it belonged there. "That's a beautiful name. You must be freezing. Do you know where your mom or dad is?" Her eyes welled with fresh tears, and she shook her head. Indecision gripped Garrick. He should call the police, he knew that. This was a lost child, possibly abandoned, definitely in danger from the elements. The responsible thing would be to contact authorities immediately. Instead, he found himself asking, "Would you like to come somewhere warm while we figure things out?" Wren studied him with an intensity that made him feel transparent, as though she could read every doubt and fear that had plagued him since his youth. Finally, she gave an almost imperceptible nod. As Garrick led her to his car, a strange certainty settled over him. His life was about to change irrevocably. What he couldn't possibly know was just how deeply this small, silent girl would alter the carefully constructed walls he'd built around his heart, or that she would be the key to unlocking secrets his own mother had buried for years. The Victorian house where Garrick had spent his entire life stood at the end of Maple Street, its gabled roof and wraparound porch giving it the appearance of a watchful sentinel. Tonight, with rain cascading down its slate shingles and fog curling around its foundation, it looked less like home and more like the setting of a Gothic novel. "It's big," Wren observed quietly from the passenger seat, her first voluntary words since telling him her name. Garrick smiled, despite his anxiety. "Too big, probably. It was my grandparents' house before it was ours." He parked in the covered carport and hurried around to open Wren's door, holding his jacket over her as they dashed to the side entrance. He punched in the security code with practiced ease, ushering the small, shivering child into the warmth of the mudroom. "Let's get you dried off," he said, reaching for a clean towel from the linen cabinet. As he gently dried her hair, he noticed a small birthmark behind her ear, a crescent moon shape that sparked an odd sense of familiarity he couldn't place. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made him tense. "Garrick, is that you making all that racket?" The voice belonged to Sirene, the night nurse who cared for his mother. She appeared in the doorway, her practical scrubs and sensible shoes, at odds with her youthful face. At 28, she had the experienced eyes of someone who had seen too much suffering and maintained compassion anyway. Her gaze fell immediately to Wren, and her expression shifted from surprise to concern. "Who's this?" "This is Wren," Garrick said, realizing how strange this must look. "I found her alone in the square. She was soaked through and freezing." Serene's nursing instincts took over. She knelt before the girl, checking her temperature with the back of her hand against Wren's forehead. "She's cold, but I don't think—" "It's hypothermia. Did you call the police?" Garrick hesitated, feeling suddenly foolish. "Not yet. I wanted to get her somewhere safe first." Serene gave him a look that balanced understanding with professional concern. "I'll make her. Some hot chocolate while you call them." "No police," Wren said suddenly, her voice small but firm. "Please." Garrick and Serene exchanged troubled glances. "Sweetie," Serene said gently, "we need to find your family. They must be worried sick about you." Wren's face remained impassive, but her knuckles whitened as she gripped her backpack tighter. "I don't have one." The simple declaration hung in the air, laden with unspoken pain that seemed too heavy for such small shoulders to bear. Garrick ran a hand through his damp hair. "Let's get her warm first, okay? Maybe some dry clothes and that hot chocolate. Then we can figure this out." As Serene led Wren toward the kitchen, Garrick's phone vibrated in his pocket. The caller ID showed his mother's room extension within the house. Lorelei was awake, likely wondering about the commotion. He answered with a practiced calm that belied his inner turmoil. "Everything's fine, Mother. I'll be up in a minute to explain." "You're late tonight." Lorelei's voice came through still strong despite her illness. "And I heard a child's voice. What's happening, Garrick?" "It's complicated," he replied, watching as Wren disappeared into the kitchen with Serene. "I found a lost girl in the square." There was a long pause before his mother spoke again. "Bring her upstairs. I want to meet her." The line went dead before he could object. Typical Lorelei. Even bedridden with the mysterious degenerative condition that had gradually claimed her mobility over the past 5 years, she maintained an ironclad control over the household. Garrick pocketed his phone with a sigh. He needed to call the police. He knew that. It was the only reasonable course of action. Yet something about Wren's quiet plea resonated with him in ways he couldn't articulate. As he headed toward the kitchen, the house's ancient heating system creaked and groaned like a living entity. The sound had always comforted him as a child, but tonight it seemed ominous, as though the house itself was warning him of what was to come. What Garrick didn't realize was that the girl sitting at his kitchen table, hands wrapped around a steaming mug of cocoa, wasn't just a lost child. She was his lost child. The grand staircase creaked under Garrick's weight as he carried Wren up to the second floor. She had changed into one of his old T-shirts, which hung like a dress on her small frame. Serene followed behind, carrying a tray with tea for Lorelei and another mug of hot chocolate for Wren. "My mother can be intense," Garrick warned the girl, softly. "Don't let her intimidate you." Wren looked up at him with those unnervingly perceptive eyes. "Is she very sick?" The question caught him off guard. He hadn't mentioned his mother's illness. "Yes, she is. How did you know?" "You have a nurse shoes in your house," Wren replied, simply nodding towards Serene's practical footwear. "And you look sad when you talk about her." Garrick exchanged a glance with Serene, who raised her eyebrows, equally impressed by the child's observation skills. "She's right," Serene whispered. "You do get that look." They reached the door to Lorelei's suite, a converted master bedroom that now housed a hospital bed and various medical equipment. Garrick knocked softly before entering, still carrying Wren. Lorelei Thorne sat propped against pillows, her silver hair meticulously styled despite her confinement, her silk robe perfectly arranged around her thin frame. At 62, she maintained, the regal bearing that had intimidated Garrick's childhood friends, and later the few women he had dared to bring home. Her sharp blue eyes, the same color as Garrick's, immediately fixed on Wren with an intensity that made him instinctively tighten his protective hold on the child. "So this is our midnight visitor," Lorelei said, her voice cultured and controlled. She extended a hand adorned with a single sapphire ring. "Come closer, child. Let me see you." Garrick set Wren down, but kept a reassuring hand on her shoulder. To his surprise, the girl approached Lorelei without hesitation, standing beside the bed with the quiet dignity that seemed so at odds with her years. "What's your name?" Lorelei asked. "Wren," came the soft reply. Something flickered across Lorelei's face, so brief Garrick almost missed it. Recognition alarm. Before he could decipher it, her features smoothed back into polite interest. "That's an unusual name," she commented. "Where are your parents, Wren?" "I don't know. She was alone in the town square," Mother Garrick interjected. "In the rain. I couldn't just leave her there." Lorelei's piercing gaze shifted from Wren to her son. "Of course not. You've always had a soft heart." There was something in her tone, not quite criticism, not quite approval, that made Garrick bristle internally. "I'm going to call the police," he said firmly. "They can contact child services." "Not tonight," Lorelei declared, with surprising conviction. When both Garrick and Seren stared at her in confusion, she added, "It's nearly 1 in the morning. The child is exhausted. And frankly, so are you, Garrick. Let her sleep in the guest room, and you can sort everything out in the morning." Garrick frowned. His mother had never been the type to bend rules or delay official procedures. Her insistence now struck him as oddly out of character. "Mrs. Thorne," Seren began cautiously, "protocol in these situations usually requires immediate reporting." "I'm well aware of protocols, Seren," Lorelei interrupted smoothly. "But I'm also aware that child services at this hour will mean this: little girl spending the night in a sterile holding room instead of a proper bed. One night won't make a difference." As Lorelei spoke, Wren's eyes wandered to the collection of photographs on the bedside table. She reached out toward one in particular, a faded image of a younger Garrick with his arm around a laughing young woman with auburn hair. Lorelei's hand shot out with surprising speed, catching Wren's wrist before she could touch the frame. "Careful, dear. Some things are fragile." The tension in the room thickened. Garrick moved forward gently, disengaging his mother's fingers from Wren's wrist. "It's late. I think we should all get some rest." As he led Wren from the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just transpired, something hidden beneath the surface of his mother's reactions. In the hallway, Wren looked up at him with those two wise eyes. "Who was the lady in the picture with you, the one with the red hair?" Garrick's chest tightened. "An old friend. Someone I knew a long time ago." "She has a nice smile," Wren observed. "Yes," he agreed softly. She did. As he tucked Wren into the guest bed minutes later, Garrick found himself studying her features more carefully. There was something about the shape of her nose, the curve of her cheekbones, that nagged at his memory. "Try to get some sleep," he told her, smoothing the covers. "Everything will look better in the morning." "Will you stay until I fall asleep?" she asked suddenly, looking very much like the 7-year-old child she was, vulnerability replacing the eerie composure she'd displayed until now. "Of course," Garrick promised, settling into the chair beside the bed. As Wren's breathing eventually deepened into sleep, his gaze drifted to the window where rain continued to lash against the glass. The woman in the photograph, Maeve Calloway, had walked out of his life 8 years ago, without explanation, taking a piece of his heart with her. He'd never quite recovered, never truly let anyone else in. What Garrick couldn't know as he watched over the sleeping child who'd appeared so mysteriously in his life was that Maeve was about to walk back in, and that the truth she carried with her would shatter everything he thought he knew about his life, his mother and the small girl who now slept peacefully under his roof. Dawn arrived with cleared skies and a crystalline quality to the air that made the previous night's storm seem like a distant dream. Garrick, who had eventually dozed off in the chair beside Wren's bed, woke with a stiff neck and momentary disorientation. Before the events of the previous night came rushing back, the bed was empty, the covers neatly arranged. "Wren," he called, rising quickly and ignoring the protest of his cramped muscles. The scent of pancakes wafted up from downstairs along with the sound of childish laughter, a sound so foreign in this house that it seemed to belong to another world entirely. Following these sensory breadcrumbs, Garrick made his way to the kitchen, where he stopped in the doorway, momentarily stunned by the scene before him. Seren stood at the stove, flipping pancakes, while Wren sat perched on a counter stool, her legs swinging freely as she carefully arranged blueberries into smiley faces on each golden disc. The morning light streamed through the windows, casting them both in a warm glow that transformed the usually austere kitchen into something from a Norman Rockwell painting. "Good morning, sleepyhead," Seren greeted him with a smile. "Coffee's fresh." Wren looked up, her face brightening. "I made you a pancake monster," she announced proudly, pointing to a particularly elaborate creation featuring blueberry eyes and a banana slice mouth. "It's terrifying," Garrick said with mock seriousness, making Wren giggle, a sound so unexpectedly delightful that he found himself smiling in response. "Has my mother been down?" he asked Seren quietly as he poured himself coffee. "Not yet. I checked on her earlier. She's having one of her bad mornings. Asked not to be disturbed until her medication kicks in." Seren lowered her voice further. "Have you decided about calling the authorities?" Before Garrick could respond, the doorbell rang, its sonorous chime echoing through the house. He frowned, glancing at his watch. "It's not even 8 yet." The bell rang again, more insistently this time. "I'll go," he said, setting down his untouched coffee. To Wren he added, "Save me that pancake monster. I want to see if it tastes as fierce as it looks." The girl nodded solemnly, though her eyes darted nervously toward the sound of the doorbell. Garrick made his way through the house, mentally preparing for what was likely a police officer responding to a report of the girl. Perhaps a neighbor had seen him bringing her in last night and called it in. He would explain the situation, cooperate, fully, though the thought of Wren being whisked away to some impersonal facility made his stomach clench uncomfortably. He opened the door to find not a uniformed officer, but a woman with windswept auburn hair and eyes the color of aged whiskey. Eyes he hadn't seen in 8 years, but had never truly forgotten. "Maeve," he breathed her name, feeling both foreign and achingly familiar on his tongue. She looked different, harder somehow, with fine lines around her eyes that spoke of worry rather than laughter. But undeniably, Maeve Calloway, the woman who had occupied a carefully locked compartment of his heart for nearly a decade. "Hello?" "Garrick," she said, her voice lower than he remembered. "I believe you have my daughter." The world tilted slightly beneath his feet. "Your daughter?" "Wren," she clarified, her eyes never leaving his. "My daughter is here, isn't she? 7 years old? Dark hair, probably didn't say much. The police said someone matching your description picked up a child from the town square last night." Garrick struggled to process this information, his mind racing to reconcile the Maeve he'd known with this woman claiming motherhood to a child who'd appeared so mysteriously in his life. "She's here," he confirmed slowly. "She was alone, Maeve. In the rain. What kind of mother?" "Let me explain." She interrupted, a flash of pain crossing her features. "Please, Garrick. It's not what you think." Before he could respond, a small voice came from behind him. "Mama!" Garrick turned to see Wren standing in the hallway, her eyes wide and uncertain. Maeve moved past him without waiting for permission, dropping to her knees to gather the child in her arms. "Oh, my little bird," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I was so worried. Are you okay? Did you get caught in that awful storm?" Wren nodded against her mother's shoulder. "The man took care of me. He gave me hot chocolate and a big shirt to sleep in." Maeve looked up at Garrick over her daughter's head, gratitude and something more complex swimming in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation inside," Garrick suggested, acutely aware they were creating a spectacle for any neighbors who might be watching. Maeve nodded, rising with Wren's hand clasped firmly in hers as they moved into the living room. Garrick closed the door behind them, his mind still struggling to process the woman's sudden reappearance in his life and her connection to the child who had so inexplicably drawn him in. "Would you like some coffee?" he offered automatically, falling back on social niceties to mask his confusion. "That would be nice," Maeve replied, though her tone suggested caffeine was the least of her concerns. As Garrick moved toward the kitchen, he caught Seren watching from the hallway, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. He gave her a small nod silently, communicating that everything was under control, though he felt anything but. When he returned with 2 mugs, Maeve was sitting on the sofa with Wren beside her, the child inexplicably calm despite the charged atmosphere. "So," Garrick began, handing Maeve her coffee. Would you like to explain how your 7-year-old daughter ended up alone in a rainstorm at midnight? Maeve's fingers tightened around the mug. We just moved to town yesterday. The movers were late and everything was chaos. Wren was supposed to be in the guest room of our rental, but when I went to check on her after dealing with some broken furniture, she was gone. I've been frantic all night, called the police immediately. Her eyes softened as she looked at her daughter. Wren has a tendency to wander when she's upset or overwhelmed, but never this far before. You scared years off my life, little bird. I'm sorry, Mama, Wren said quietly. I wanted to see the fountain in the square like in your pictures, but then it started raining and I couldn't remember the way back. Garrick studied the interaction between mother and child, noting the genuine affection and concern in Maeve's manner. Whatever he might think of her personally, her love for her daughter seemed unquestionable. You have pictures of Millfield, he asked, surprised. I didn't know you'd ever been here before. Something flickered across Maeve's face, hesitation perhaps, or calculation. There's a lot we need to talk about, Garrick, she said slowly. Things I should have told you years ago. The air in the room seemed to thicken with unspoken words. Garrick was about to press further when a new voice joined the conversation. Well, isn't this a reunion? Lorelei stood in the doorway, leaning heavily on her cane, but somehow managing to project authority despite her physical frailty. Her gaze raked over Maeve with undisguised hostility. Hello, Mrs. Thorne, Maeve said, rising to her feet. It's been a long time. Not long enough, Lorelei replied coldly. I see you've returned to disrupt our lives once again. Mother, Garrick admonished, shocked by her open rudeness. But Maeve's attention had shifted entirely to Lorelei, her expression hardening. Did you know? She demanded. When you saw her last night, did you recognize her? Lorelei's chin lifted defiantly. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do. Maeve countered, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. She turned to Garrick, her eyes now shining with unshed tears. Look at her, Garrick. Really look at her. Confused, Garrick shifted his gaze to Wren, who sat watching the adults with solemn attention. For the first time he truly studied her features, the shape of her eyes, the curve of her jaw, the way her eyebrows furrowed slightly in concentration, features that seemed increasingly impossibly familiar. She has your eyes, Maeve said softly. Everyone says so. The room began to spin slightly as implications crashed over him. What are you saying, Maeve? Don't, Lorelei interjected sharply. Maeve, don't you dare... But Maeve's gaze remained locked with Garrick's, her voice steady despite the tears now spilling down her cheeks. Wren is your daughter, Garrick, yours and mine. She's 7 years old. I was pregnant when I left. The mug slipped from Garrick's fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor and splashing coffee across his feet. But he felt nothing, not the heat of the liquid, not the surprise of the impact. There was only a roaring in his ears as he stared at the child who now looked back at him, with eyes that were undeniably the same shade of blue as his own. And as he turned to his mother, the guilt written across her face told him everything. He needed to know about why Maeve had disappeared from his life 8 years ago, and why he'd never known about the daughter who now sat before him, a living bridge between past and present. The broken mug lay forgotten on the floor, coffee seeping into the antique hardwood as silence engulfed the room. Garrick stood frozen, his gaze moving from Wren to Maeve to his mother, trying to process the revelation that had just upended his world. She's my daughter. He finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Wren watched him with those familiar blue eyes, his eyes, her expression unreadable. Yes, Maeve confirmed softly. She's yours. Garrick sank onto the nearest chair legs, suddenly unable to support him. 7 years, he said, the magnitude of lost time crashing over him. 7 years I didn't know she existed. I tried to tell you, Maeve said, shooting a pointed look at Lorelei. I wrote letters, dozens of them. I called and called until your number was changed. Lorelei's knuckles whitened around the handle of her cane. You were no good for him, she said, her voice sharp with defensive anger. A struggling artist with no prospects, no stability, Garrick was building a career, establishing himself. So you intercepted my letters, Maeve demanded, rising to her feet. How hid my calls? You decided that your son shouldn't know he had a child. Mother. Garrick cut in his voice dangerously quiet. Is this true? The silence that followed was all the confirmation he needed. Lorelei's chin lifted slightly, a gesture of defiance that couldn't mask the guilt in her eyes. I did what I thought was best for you, she finally said. Best for me, Garrick repeated incredulously. You decided it was best for me to miss the first 7 years of my daughter's life. Seren, who had been watching silently from the doorway, stepped forward. Mrs. Thorne, I think you should sit down. Your heart rate— My heart is fine, Lorelei snapped, though she allowed Seren to guide her to a chair. It's the only thing about me that still works properly. Wren suddenly slipped off the sofa and approached Garrick, stopping just before him. Her small hand reached out hesitantly, hovering in the air between them. Are you really my dad? She asked, her voice small but steady. The simple question cut through the tension, bringing Garrick's focus entirely to the child before him. He tried to see himself in her features, the shape of her nose, perhaps the set of her jaw. The eyes, certainly. How had he not noticed immediately? I think I am, he answered honestly, kneeling to meet her at eye level. I'm sorry I didn't know about you until now. Wren considered this with a seriousness that seemed beyond her years. It's okay, she said finally. I didn't know about you either. The simplicity of her forgiveness made his throat tighten. Well, he managed, I guess we have a lot of catching up to do. A small smile curved her lips, Maeve's smile he realized with a pang. I'm good at catching up. I skipped first grade. Clever, just like your mother, he said, then immediately wondered if it was the right thing to say. Everything felt like uncharted territory, a conversational minefield where the wrong word might cause irreparable damage. And stubborn like her father, Maeve added softly from behind them. Garrick rose, suddenly remembering they weren't alone, that this intensely personal moment was being witnessed by not only Maeve, but also his mother and Seren. The weight of 7 years of deception pressed on his chest, making it difficult to breathe. Seren, he said, fighting to keep his voice steady. Would you mind taking Wren to finish her breakfast? I think the adults need to talk. Understanding flashed in the nurse's eyes. Come on, Wren, she said brightly. Those pancake monsters are getting cold, and I bet we can find some chocolate chips to add to the next batch. As soon as they left the room, Garrick turned to his mother, rage and betrayal burning beneath his carefully controlled exterior. How could you? He demanded, his voice low but intense. How could you keep this from me? Lorelei's hand trembled, slightly as she adjusted the silk scarf around her neck, a nervous gesture he'd rarely seen from his perpetually composed mother. You were 26, she began, as though this explained everything. Just starting to make partner at the firm. Maeve was talking about moving to Paris for some art fellowship. The timing was all wrong. That wasn't your decision to make, Garrick. Exploded the control he'd maintained for Wren's sake, shattering. It was my life, my future, my child. Our child, Maeve corrected quietly. Garrick ran a hand through his hair, struggling to process the magnitude of his mother's betrayal. Did Dad know before he died? Did he know about this? Pain flashed across Lorelei's face. No, your father would have— She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. He would have told you despite my objections. It was after he passed that you received that promotion, that your career finally started taking off. I couldn't let Maeve's pregnancy derail everything you'd worked for. So you lied, Garrick said flatly. For 7 years you've known you had a granddaughter and said nothing. I protected you, Lorelei insisted, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. Maeve, who had been watching this exchange with contained fury, finally spoke. I came to your house, she said to Lorelei. 3 months after Wren was born. I showed you pictures, begged you to tell Garrick. You said he was seeing someone else, that he was happy that a baby would only complicate things. Garrick turned to his mother, silently demanding confirmation or denial. You were dating that lawyer from Boston, Lorelei said defensively. Jessica something. Things seemed serious. We went on 4 dates, Garrick exclaimed. 4 mediocre dates with a woman I barely remember. That's what you used to justify keeping my child from me. The full weight of what his mother had done began to sink in. She hadn't just intercepted letters or blocked phone calls. She had actively, repeatedly chosen to prevent him from knowing his own daughter had lied to his face every day for 7 years. "Where are they?" he asked suddenly. "What?" Lorelei looked confused. "The letters, Maeve's letters, where are they?" His mother's gaze slid away. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me, not again." Garrick's voice was dangerously quiet. "You're too meticulous to throw them away. Where are they?" The silence stretched between them, thick with decades of manipulation disguised as maternal protection. "My study," Lorelei finally admitted. "The locked drawer in my desk. The small silver key is in my jewelry box." Garrick turned to Maeve, years of unresolved emotions churning beneath the surface. "I need to see them, all of them. Then we'll talk about arrangements." "Arrangements," Maeve repeated, her eyebrows drawing together. "For Wren. Visitation support, whatever needs to be done legally to establish that I'm her father." "Garrick," Maeve began, her expression softening. "I didn't come here for money or legal documents. I came because Wren deserves to know her father and because you deserve to know your daughter." Before he could respond, the sound of childish laughter drifted in from the kitchen, a jarring reminder of innocence amid the adult betrayals and recriminations. "We'll figure it out," Garrick said, suddenly exhausted. "But right now I need I need to think." He moved toward the door only to be stopped by his mother's voice. "Garrick," Lorelei called, sounding suddenly old and vulnerable. "I only ever wanted what was best for you." He paused but didn't turn around. "The problem, Mother, is that you decided what was best without ever asking what I wanted. You stole 7 years I can never get back." As he walked out of the room, his mind was already racing ahead to what came next. How to build a relationship with a 7-year-old stranger who shared his blood. How to co-parent with a woman he'd once loved and lost. How to forgive a mother whose betrayal cut deeper than any wound he'd ever experienced. What he couldn't know was that the letters hidden in his mother's desk contained more secrets than even Maeve realized. Secrets that would force him to question everything he thought. He knew about his family and himself. The antique key turned with a resistance that spoke of years of disuse. Garrick stood in his mother's study, a room that had always been off-limits when he was growing up, the sanctum of Lorelei's private thoughts and dealings. The polished mahogany desk, the leather-bound books lining the walls, the faint scent of her signature perfume. It all spoke of the controlled, measured persona his mother had always presented to the world. And now he was about to uncover the evidence of her greatest deception. The drawer slid open with a whispered protest, revealing a stack of envelopes bound with a faded blue ribbon. Garrick lifted them carefully as though they might disintegrate at his touch. The top envelope bore his name in Maeve's distinctive handwriting, artistic yet precise, just like the woman herself. He counted 27 envelopes in total, 27 communications that had never reached him, 27 chances to know about his daughter, that his mother had systematically denied him. With unsteady fingers, he untied the ribbon and opened the first letter dated 8 years ago. "Garrick, I don't know how to write this, so I'll just say it directly. I'm pregnant. About 10 weeks along now. I know this isn't what either of us planned, but I want you to know I'm keeping this baby. Our baby. I understand if you need time to process this. Call me when you're ready to talk. Whatever you decide, I want you to be part of this child's life, even if we aren't together anymore. I miss you. Maeve." The simplicity of it, the openness. He could almost hear her voice speaking the words. Garrick moved through the letters chronologically, each one revealing another piece of the life he should have shared. Maeve's first ultrasound appointment, the moment she felt the baby kick. Her decision to move back to her hometown for her mother's support after receiving no response from him. The letters became more desperate, then resigned and finally determined as she documented Wren's birth. First smile, first steps, first words. Always with the same refrain. "She reminds me of you. She should know her father. Please contact me. Bye." The time he reached the last letter, dated just over a year ago, Garrick's cheeks were wet with silent tears. The final communication was different, more formal, with an attorney's address at the top. "Mr. Thorne." Over the past 6 years, I have made countless attempts to contact you regarding our daughter Wren Calloway. As these attempts have been met with silence, I am now formally notifying you of my intent to relocate overseas with Wren for a 2-year artist residency in Barcelona. If you wish to assert any parental rights before our departure, please contact my attorney at the address above. Otherwise, I will assume you have no interest in establishing a relationship with your daughter. For Wren's sake, I sincerely hope you will finally respond. Maeve Calloway. Garrick stared at the letter, mind-racing. Barcelona. Maeve had planned to take Wren out of the country entirely. What had changed? I never went. He looked up to find Maeve standing in the doorway, watching him with an unreadable expression. My mother died, she continued, entering the study. Just before we were supposed to leave. Pancreatic cancer, very sudden, it changed everything. I realized Wren had already lost one grandparent, and now that my mother was gone, she had no extended family left except me, Garrick finished. And my mother. Yes, Maeve acknowledged, sitting in the leather chair across from him. So I turned down the residency and decided to move here instead. To give Wren a chance to know her roots, even if you still wanted nothing to do with us. Garrick gestured to the pile of opened letters between them. I never knew, Maeve. I never received a single one of these. If you had, she prompted when he didn't continue. Everything would have been different, he said simply. A complicated mix of emotions crossed Maeve's face. Relief, lingering anger, cautious hope. Where do we go from here? She asked. Before Garrick could respond, a small voice came from the doorway. Are you mad at each other? They both turned, to see Wren standing there, a half-eaten cookie in her hand, crumbs dusting the front of her borrowed t-shirt. No, little bird, Maeve assured her. We're just talking about grown-up things. Wren approached the desk, eyeing the scattered letters. Are those about me? Garrick and Maeve exchanged glances silently, debating how much to share with a 7-year-old. Yes, Garrick answered honestly. They're letters your mom wrote to tell me about you, but I never got to read them until today. Wren's brow furrowed in consideration. Is that why you didn't come see me, because you didn't get the letters? The simple question pierced Garrick's heart. That's exactly why, he managed, his voice rough with emotion. If I had known about you, I would have been there. For everything. Wren nodded, accepting this explanation, with the straightforward logic of childhood. The nurse lady said lunch is almost ready. She made dinosaur-shaped sandwiches. Despite everything, Garrick found himself smiling. Dinosaur sandwiches sound pretty important. We'll be there in a minute, okay? As Wren trotted off, seemingly satisfied, Maeve leaned back in her chair. She's taking this remarkably well. Kids are resilient, Garrick observed. More so than adults sometimes. She's been asking about you her whole life, Maeve admitted. I always told her that her daddy lived far away, that he didn't know about. Her butt would have loved her if he did. I never wanted her to think she was unwanted. Garrick nodded, grateful for Maeve's foresight in protecting their daughter from the pain of perceived rejection. Thank you for that. A weighted silence fell between them, years of missed opportunities and misunderstandings hovering in the air. I need to ask you something, Garrick finally said, gesturing to the last letter. If your mother hadn't died, would you have taken Wren to Spain without ever telling me, without ever letting me meet her? Maeve's eyes flashed with a hint of the fiery spirit he remembered. I hired a private investigator before writing that letter, she revealed, to make absolutely certain you were receiving my communications. He reported that you were living with your mother, that you checked the mail personally most days, that there was no reason you shouldn't be getting my letters. So you thought I was deliberately ignoring you, Garrick realized, that I knew about Wren and chose not to be involved. What was I supposed to think? Maeve asked, her voice rising slightly. 7 years of silence, Garrick. 7 years of watching. Our daughter grow up without her father, of having to answer her questions about why you never came to see her. Do you have any idea how that felt? No, he admitted quietly. Just as you have no idea how it feels to learn in a single day that you have a 7-year-old daughter and that your mother has been lying to you for her entire life. The tension between them deflated slightly, mutual recognition of pain replacing recrimination. We've both been victims in this, Maeve acknowledged. But Wren has been the biggest victim of all. Garrick nodded, gathering the letters and carefully replacing them in the envelope. We can't get those years back, he said, but we can try to do better going forward, for her sake. As they left the study to join Wren for lunch, neither noticed Lorelei watching from the shadows of the hallway, her face a mask of complex emotions. Nor did they see her slip into the study after they'd gone removing a small box from a hidden compartment behind the bookshelf. A box that contained the one letter Garrick hadn't read, the one letter Lorelei had kept separate from the others. The letter that explained why she had gone to such lengths to keep Maeve and her grandchild out of her son's life, and the secret she had carried for over 30 years that would shake the very foundations of the Thorne family, if ever revealed. 3 days had passed since Maeve's return, and the revelation that had shattered Garrick's understanding of his life. 3 days of awkward negotiations about bedtimes and dietary preferences as Wren split her time between Garrick's house and the small apartment Maeve had rented on the other side of town. 3 days of stilted conversation with his mother, whose illness seemed to worsen under the weight of exposed secrets. Garrick stood in his kitchen, mindlessly stirring a cup of coffee as dawn painted the sky in hesitant pastels. Sleep had become elusive, his mind constantly replaying moments from the past, searching for clues he should have recognized, signs of his mother's deception he had somehow missed. "You're up early," Seren observed, entering the kitchen in her scrubs, ready for the morning shift of caring for Lorelei. "Again." "Couldn't sleep," he admitted. "Again." Seren studied him with the professional assessment of a nurse and the personal concern of someone who had worked in his home for years. "Oh, you can't keep going like this, Garrick. The human body needs rest, even yours." He managed a weak smile. "I'll sleep when I've figured out how to be a father to a 7-year-old I met 3 days ago." "You're doing fine with Wren," Seren assured, him pouring her own coffee. "Children are more adaptable than we give them credit for. Yesterday she told me you're pretty good at braiding hair for a beginner." The memory of his clumsy attempts to help Wren with her hair before she left for her day with Maeve brought a genuine smile to his face. "High praise indeed." "It is," Seren agreed, "but I wasn't talking about Wren, I meant your mother." Garrick's expression hardened. "What about her?" "Her blood pressure has been elevated since all this started. Her tremors are worse, she barely touches her food." "That's not my problem," Garrick said flatly, though a flicker of concern crossed his features despite his words. Seren sighed. "Look, I'm not defending what she did. It was wrong on every level, but she's still your mother and she's still my patient. Her condition is deteriorating and stress only accelerates the process." Garrick ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "What am I supposed to do? Seren, pretend everything's fine? Act like she didn't rob me of 7 years with my daughter?" "No," she replied gently, "but maybe find a way to coexist in the same house without this constant tension. For everyone's sake, including Wren's." Before he could respond, his phone chimed with a message from Maeve. "Wren forgot her backpack with the science project. Can I swing by to get it?" Garrick texted back a quick affirmative, then glanced at the kitchen clock. "Maeve's coming to pick up Wren's backpack. I should probably shower and change before they arrive." Seren nodded. "I'll go check on your mother." "But Garrick," she added as he turned to leave, "think about what I said. This house is too small for the amount of anger it's currently holding." 20 minutes later, freshly showered and marginally more prepared to face the day, Garrick opened the front door to find not just Maeve but Wren as well, both of them wearing matching expressions of excitement. "I thought you were just picking up the backpack," he said by way of greeting. "Change of plans," Maeve replied, her eyes bright with an enthusiasm he remembered from their early days together. "The elementary school called. They can see us this morning about enrolling Wren for the fall semester." "That's great," Garrick said, stepping aside to let them in. "The backpack's in the living room, I think." "Can I go get it?" Wren asked, bouncing slightly on her toes. When Garrick nodded, she darted past him into the house. Maeve watched her go with a fond smile. "She's been talking non-stop about the science lab they showed us on the school website. Apparently they have a real skeleton." "A plastic skeleton," Garrick corrected automatically. "You've seen it?" Maeve asked, surprised. "I went to Millfield Elementary," he reminded her. "The same skeleton was there when I was a kid. His name was Oscar. Maeve's eyes widened. They're still using the same prop after all these years. Small town, Garrick shrugged. Small budget. A moment of comfortable nostalgia settled between them, a brief respite from the complicated emotions of recent days. Then Maeve's expression grew more serious. "I was hoping you might want to come with us," she said. "To the school meeting. As her father, you should be involved in these decisions, and they'll need your information for the paperwork anyway." The simple inclusion, the acknowledgement of his place in Wren's life, affected Garrick more deeply than he expected. "I'd like that," he managed. "Great," Wren exclaimed, reappearing with her backpack. "Now we can all go together like a real family." The innocent observation hung in the air, creating a moment of awkward awareness between the adults. Maeve recovered first, smoothing a hand over Wren's hair. "We're not a traditional family, little bird," she explained gently. "But we're still your family, just arranged a bit differently. Your dad and I both love you very much." Wren considered this, head tilted slightly. "Like Maya in my class, she has 2 houses and her parents don't live together, but they both come. I know her ballet recitals." "Exactly like that," Garrick confirmed, marveling at the child's straightforward acceptance of complex adult situations. "Cool," Wren declared. Then, with the lightning-quick subject changes typical of her age, "Can we get ice cream after the school?" "We'll see," Maeve and Garrick responded in unison, then exchanged surprised glances that melted into tentative smiles. "I heard voices," came Lorelei's voice as she appeared in the hallway, leaning heavily on her cane. She looked paler than usual, the silk scarf around her neck emphasizing rather than disguising her thinness. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Wren, oblivious to the tension, brightened at the sight of Garrick's mother. "So we're going to see my new school," she announced, "and maybe get ice cream after." "How nice," Lorelei replied, her gaze shifting between her son and Maeve. "Garrick, might I have a word before you leave?" "We're actually in a bit of a hurry," he responded coolly. "It will only take a moment," Lorelei insisted, a hint of her old authority surfacing despite her weakened state. Maeve touched Garrick's arm lightly. "We have time," she said quietly. "Wren and I can wait in the car." After they left, Garrick turned to his mother with barely contained impatience. "What is it?" Lorelei moved to the nearest chair, the effort, Fev standing, clearly taxing her strength. "I've been thinking about what happens next," she began. "Next." "With Wren," she clarified. "With your new arrangement with Maeve." Garrick crossed his arms defensively. "That's between Maeve and me. It doesn't concern you." "But it does," Lorelei countered. "This is still my home, and if Wren is to spend time here, we need to establish some parameters." "Parameters?" Garrick repeated incredulously. "You're in no position to be setting terms, Mother. Not after what you did." Lorelei's fingers tightened around the handle of her cane. "I know you're angry." "Angry doesn't begin to cover it," he interrupted. "You stole years I can never get back. Years of Wren's life. Her first steps, her first words, her first day of school. Gone. Because you decided you knew what was best for me." "I did what I thought was right at the time," Lorelei said, her voice wavering slightly. "I was wrong, terribly wrong, but I can't change the past, Garrick. None of us can." "No," he agreed bitterly. "We can't." A heavy silence fell between them, decades of unspoken expectations and disappointments crystallizing in the morning light. "I want to know my granddaughter," Lorelei finally said, her usual commanding tone replaced by something more vulnerable. "I want the chance to make amends in whatever time I have left." The mention of her mortality, something they both knew but rarely acknowledged, softened Garrick's expression slightly. "That's not up to me," he said. "It's up to Maeve. And eventually it will be up to Wren." Lorelei nodded, accepting this limitation with uncharacteristic grace. "There's something else," she added, reaching into the pocket of her robe. "Something I should have given you days ago." She extended her hand, revealing a small, ornate key, unlike any Garrick had seen before. "In my bedroom behind the painting of the lighthouse, there's a wall safe. This opens it. Inside you'll find explanations for everything." Garrick took the key, confusion mixing with renewed wariness. "Explanations for what exactly?" For why I kept Maeve and Wren from you, Lorelei said, her eyes suddenly appearing much older than her 62 years. There are things about our family, about your father, that I've never told you, things I thought I was protecting you from. Before Garrick could demand clarification, a car horn sounded from outside, a gentle reminder that Maeve and Wren were waiting. This conversation isn't over, he warned his mother, pocketing the key. No, she agreed wearily, but perhaps when it continues, you'll understand my actions a little better. Not forgive, perhaps, but understand. As Garrick left to join Maeve and Wren, his mind was already conjuring possibilities of what secrets the wall safe might contain. What possible explanation could justify his mother's years of deception? The weight of the small key in his pocket seemed disproportionate to its size, as though it carried not just the potential to unlock a physical safe, but to unravel the carefully constructed narrative of his entire life. What he couldn't know was that the contents of that safe would force him to reevaluate not just his relationship with his mother, but his understanding of his own identity, and that the revelations within would test the fragile new bonds forming. Between him, Maeve, and the daughter they were only beginning to know. The school meeting had gone surprisingly well. Millfield Elementary's principal, a former classmate of Garrick's, had been warm and accommodating, walking them through the enrollment process with minimal bureaucratic complications. Wren, with her usual quiet confidence, had charmed everyone, particularly when she correctly identified all the bones in Oscar, the skeleton, during their tour of the science lab. Now, as promised, they sat at Millfield's only ice cream parlor, watching Wren methodically work her way through a sundae almost as big as her head. She has your focus, Garrick observed to Maeve, nodding toward their daughter's systematic approach to the dessert. The way she tackles one section at a time, completely absorbed. Maeve smiled, the afternoon sunlight catching the copper highlights in her hair. But she has your sweet tooth. I was never much for desserts. I remember, Garrick said, memories of their 3-year relationship surfacing with unexpected clarity. You always ordered coffee instead of dessert. Drove me crazy. A comfortable silence settled between them, as they watched Wren, both lost in thoughts of what might have been. Family outings like this one over the years, sharing observations about their daughter's quirks and preferences, the simple pleasure of seeing themselves reflected in a child they created together. This is nice, Maeve finally said, voicing what they were both feeling. Almost like we're a normal family, Garrick finished. I was going to say like what should have been, but yes, that too. The wistfulness in her voice resonated with Garrick's own emotions, regret for lost time mingled with cautious hope for the future. Before he could respond, his phone vibrated, with a text from Seren. Your mother took a fall, nothing broken, but she's asking for you. No rush, but come when you can. Garrick frowned at the screen, conflicting emotions washing over him. On one hand, he was still furious with Lorelei for her deception. On the other, she was still his mother, still ill, still vulnerable, despite her manipulations. Everything okay? Maeve asked, noticing his expression. My mother fell, he explained, showing her the message. Seren says it's not serious, but you should go, Maeve finished for him. Of course you should. Garrick hesitated, torn between his obligation to Lorelei and his desire to extend this rare moment of normalcy with Maeve and Wren. I've really enjoyed today, he admitted. Being part of Wren's life, even in this small way, making decisions together. Something softened in Maeve's expression. This doesn't have to be a one-time thing, Garrick. We're going to be co-parents for the rest of our lives. There will be plenty more school meetings and ice cream outings. I know, he acknowledged. It's just, after missing so much. Go, Maeve said gently. We'll have dinner at my place tomorrow night. You can help Wren with her unpacking. She has very strong opinions about how her book should be arranged. Garrick smiled, grateful for her understanding. He leaned down to eye level with Wren, who was now scraping the last bits of chocolate sauce from her bowl. Hey, kiddo, I need to go check on Grandma Lorelei. She had a little fall. Wren's brow furrowed with concern. Is she hurt bad? No, but I should make sure she's okay. I'll see you tomorrow for dinner, though. Can you bring your building blocks? Wren asked, referring to the architectural modeling kit she'd discovered in his study. "I want to make a castle with a moat." "Absolutely," he promised, touched by her easy acceptance of his presence in her life. "The deluxe castle-building kit coming right up." The drive home was filled with thoughts of the key Lorelei had given him that morning. What possible secrets could be hidden in her safe that would explain, if not justify, her actions? And did he even want to know? Or would it simply be another manipulation, another attempt to control the narrative? When he arrived home, he found Seren in the kitchen preparing tea. "How is she?" he asked without preamble. "Physically, she's fine." Seren replied, her professional demeanor softened by genuine concern. She caught herself on the bedpost, might have some bruising on her hip, but nothing serious. And otherwise, Seren hesitated. "She seems resigned, like she's waiting for something inevitable. She's been in her room since it happened, barely speaking." Garrick nodded, a decision crystallizing in his mind. "I'll take her the tea." "That would be good," Serene agreed, relief evident in her voice. "I think she needs family right now, not a nurse." Moments later, Garrick knocked softly on his mother's bedroom door, a steaming cup of her favorite Earl Grey in hand. "Come in," Lorelei called, her voice weaker than he remembered. She sat in her reading chair by the window, a thick shawl wrapped around her shoulders despite the warmth of the day. The painting of the lighthouse, a family heirloom that had hung in the same spot for as long as Garrick could remember, loomed above her like a silent sentinel. "Seren tells me you had a fall," he said, setting the tea on the side table. "A momentary lapse in balance?" Lorelei dismissed, though the tremor in her hands as she reached for the cup belied her casual tone. "Nothing to concern yourself with." Garrick's gaze drifted to the painting, then back to his mother. "You gave me a key this morning." Lorelei's fingers stilled around the teacup. "Yes," she acknowledged. "I did." "What will I find in that safe, Mother?" She took a deliberate sip of tea before answering. "The truth. Some of it will hurt you. None of it will be what you expect." "More family secrets?" Garrick asked, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. "Family history," Lorelei corrected. "Sometimes the distinction matters." A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the soft ticking of the antique clock on the mantel. Another family heirloom, another piece of the Thorne legacy that Garrick had taken for granted his entire life. "Did you have a nice time at the school?" Lorelei asked unexpectedly. The question caught Garrick off guard. "Yes," he answered cautiously. "Wren made quite an impression on the staff." A ghost of a smile touched Lorelei's lips. "She's a remarkable child, reminds me of you at that age, observant, thoughtful." "She has Maeve's creativity too," Garrick found himself saying, "and her laugh." "The best of both of you," Lorelei murmured, her gaze drifting to the window where late afternoon light cast long shadows across the garden. "That's how it should be." Something in her tone, a resignation perhaps or acceptance, made Garrick study her more carefully. "Why did you ask me about the school visit? You've barely acknowledged Wren's existence since she arrived." Lorelei's hands trembled slightly as she set down her teacup. "Because I'm trying, Garrick. In my limited, imperfect way, I'm trying to be part of this new reality, to make amends for what I've done." The admission, stripped of her usual defenses, struck Garrick more powerfully than any of their previous confrontations. This wasn't the controlling matriarch he'd grown up with, but a diminished version. Still proud, but finally acknowledging her fallibility. "I'm going to open the safe," he told her, neither a request nor a question. Lorelei nodded. "I know. That's why I gave you the key." Garrick stood, moving toward the painting. "Would you prefer to be alone when I do?" A flicker of something, fear, resignation, crossed her features. "No," she said quietly. "I've carried these secrets alone for too long. Perhaps it's fitting that we face them together." With a sense of crossing a threshold from which there was no return, Garrick carefully removed the painting from the wall, revealing a small ornate safe built into the plaster. The keyhole, tarnished with age, accepted the antique key with a resistance that suggested it hadn't been opened in years. Inside lay a single manila envelope, yellowed with age, and a small velvet jewelry box. Garrick removed both, turning to face his mother with a questioning look. "Open the envelope first," Lorelei instructed, her voice steady, despite the tension evident in her posture. Inside, Garrick found several documents, a birth certificate that appeared to be his own, though some details seemed wrong medical records. A faded photograph of a young woman he didn't recognize, and a letter addressed to his father, dated a year before Garrick's birth. As he began to read, the foundations of his identity began to crumble beneath him. The letter from a lawyer in Boston detailed arrangements for the private adoption of an infant boy, arrangements that included a substantial payment to the birth mother and absolute confidentiality. "I don't understand," Garrick said, looking up from the documents with growing disbelief. "These dates, this birth certificate, you were adopted," Lorelei confirmed, her voice barely above a whisper, "when you were 3 days old. Your father and I had been trying for years. The pregnancy I had before you. I lost the baby at 7 months. The doctors said it would be dangerous for me to try again." Garrick sank into the chair opposite her, trying to process this revelation. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Your father wanted to when you were old enough to understand. I was the one who insisted we keep it private. I was afraid—" Lorelei's voice broke a rare display of vulnerability. "I was afraid you would feel less ours somehow. That knowing would change how you felt about us, about being a thorn." "That still doesn't explain why you kept Maeve and Wren from me," Garrick said, struggling to connect these revelations to his mother's more recent deceptions. Lorelei gestured to the jewelry box he still held. "Open it, please." Inside lay a simple gold locket. When Garrick pressed the clasp, it opened to reveal a tiny photograph of a young woman, the same woman from the faded photo in the envelope. "Her name was Catherine," Lorelei said softly. "Your birth mother. She was 19 when she had you, a talented artist studying at the Boston Conservatory. She had auburn hair and a laugh that could light up a room. The adoption agency discouraged contact, but I wanted to know about the woman who gave to us our son." Garrick stared at the small image, searching for traces of himself in the unfamiliar features. "She looks like Maeve," Lorelei finished for him. "That's why I reacted so strongly when you brought her home all those years ago." The resemblance was striking, not just physically, but her mannerisms, her artistic temperament. It was like seeing a ghost. Understanding began to dawn, terrible in its clarity. "You thought I was attracted to Maeve because she reminded me of my birth mother, some kind of subconscious connection." Lorelei nodded, tears now flowing freely down her lined face. It seemed unnatural somehow, too coincidental. When she told me she was pregnant, all I could think about was the cycle repeating. Another young artist, another child born in complicated circumstances. "So you made the decision for me, Garrick," said anger resurging despite his shock. "Again, just like you and father decided not to tell me I was adopted." "I told myself I was protecting you," Lorelei admitted. "But I was protecting myself too. My idea of what our family should be. My fear of losing you to a truth I couldn't control." The weight of these revelations pressed on Garrick's chest, making it difficult to breathe. His entire identity, the very foundation of who he believed himself to be, had been built on carefully constructed lies. And now Wren, the daughter he'd only just discovered, represented both a continuation of that deception and a chance for something more authentic. "I need time to process this," he said finally, gathering the documents with unsteady hands. "Of course," Lorelei agreed, watching him with a mixture of trepidation and relief, as though the unburdening of her secrets had both liberated and terrified her. "But Garrick, there's one more thing you should know." He paused at the doorway, the manila envelope clutched to his chest like a shield. "Catherine, your birth mother, she died 8 years ago. Pancreatic cancer." Lorelei's voice caught on the words. "The same illness that claimed Maeve's mother last year. I only discovered it recently when I tried to find information about your biological family's medical history. The coincidence seemed significant somehow." Garrick stood frozen, the implications of this final revelation washing over him in cold waves. Could Maeve's mother and his birth mother have been related? Could he and Maeve share some distant connection? As he left the room, mind reeling with questions he'd never thought to ask one. Certainty emerged from the chaos of his thoughts. The truth, so long buried beneath layers of secrecy and manipulation, was finally beginning to surface. What remained to be seen was whether that truth would destroy the fragile new connections forming in his life, or whether it would become the foundation for something stronger than the lies that had preceded it. The key to Lorelei's safe had, indeed, unlocked more than a hidden compartment in the wall. It had unlocked a Pandora's box of family secrets that now threatened to redefine everything Garrick thought he knew about himself and about the woman who had given birth to his child. The gentle hum of Maeve's refrigerator provided the only sound in her small kitchen. As Garrick sat at the table, the contents of Lorelei's safe spread before him. After leaving his mother's room the previous day, he had spent hours alone in his study attempting to process the seismic shift in his understanding of himself. Now, having arrived early for their planned dinner, he found himself compelled to share these revelations with Maeve before Wren returned from her playdate with a neighbor's child. Adopted, Maeve repeated, processing the words slowly as she sank into the chair opposite him. All this time, and you never knew? Garrick shook his head, still struggling to reconcile this new reality with the identity he'd carried for 34 years. My whole life I thought I knew exactly who I was. Garrick Thorne, son of William and Lorelei Thorne, descended from a long line of respectable New Englanders with their orderly lives and unspoken expectations. And now, Maeve prompted gently, when he fell silent. Now I don't know, he admitted. Half my genetic makeup comes from strangers, people with no names, no faces, just these. He gestured to the documents between them. Maeve reached across the table, her fingers lightly touching the edge of the birth certificate. May I? At his nod, she drew the paper closer, studying it with the careful attention she'd always given to her artwork. Catherine Wilson, she read aloud. 19 years old, born in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Something in her tone made Garrick look up sharply. What is it? Maeve's brow furrowed in concentration. My mother was from Cambridge. She had a sister named Catherine who died before I was born. The family never talked about her much. Some kind of estrangement, I gathered. A chill ran down Garrick's spine. Your mother's maiden name, what was it? Wilson, Maeve whispered, the color draining from her face as the implication became clear. Oh my God, Garrick, if this Catherine was my mother's sister, then she was your aunt. Garrick finished the room, seeming to tilt slightly beneath him. And I'm my cousin, Maeve concluded, her voice faint with shock. We're related by blood. The revelation hung between them, recontextualizing not just their past relationship, but their present circumstances and the existence of their daughter. We need to be sure, Garrick said, forcing himself to think rationally despite the emotional whirlwind. Catherine Wilson could be a common name. We need more information. Maeve nodded, visibly gathering herself. My mother kept old family albums. They're in one of the unpacked boxes in my bedroom. Let me check. While she disappeared into the bedroom, Garrick stared at the faded photograph of Catherine Wilson, the woman who had given birth to him, who might have been Maeve's aunt, who had died of the same disease that claimed Maeve's mother. The connections were too specific, too precise to be coincidental. Maeve returned moments later, with a worn leather album, her hands trembling slightly as she placed it on the table. I found it, she said, her voice unsteady. There aren't many pictures of her, but... She opened the album to a marked page revealing a black and white photograph of two young women standing arm in arm before a Christmas tree. The resemblance between them was unmistakable, sisters clearly with the same heart-shaped face and wide-set eyes. That's my mother on the right, Maeve explained, pointing to the slightly shorter woman. And that's Catherine, her older sister. Garrick stared at the image, comparing it to the small photograph from the locket. There was no question. They were the same woman. Catherine Wilson, his birth mother, had indeed been Maeve's aunt. I don't understand, he said, running a hand through his hair in agitation. If they were sisters, why didn't your mother ever mention that her sister had a child, that somewhere out there she had a nephew? Maeve turned the album's pages, slowly revealing more family photographs, none featuring Catherine beyond her early 20s. My mother said Catherine ran away to pursue art against my grandparents' wishes. There was some kind of falling out. By the time I was born, Catherine wasn't mentioned in the family anymore. She didn't run away, Garrick said quietly. She got pregnant with me. The implications continued to unspool between them. The coincidence that wasn't a coincidence at all of Maeve moving to Millfield, of Garrick finding Wren in the square, of their lives intersecting again after 8 years apart. "Do you think your mother knew?" Maeve asked suddenly. "When we were dating, do you think she realized I was the niece of your birth mother?" Garrick considered this, remembering Lorelei's words. The resemblance was striking, not just physically, but her mannerisms, her artistic temperament. It was like seeing a ghost. "She suspected something," he acknowledged, "but I don't think she knew for certain until recently, when she looked into my biological family's medical history after your mother died." Maeve stood abruptly, pacing the small kitchen with nervous energy. I don't even know what this is. Incredible, disturbing, some cosmic joke. It explains some things," Garrick said thoughtfully. "Why we felt such an immediate connection when we met. Why Wren seemed familiar to me even before I knew she was my daughter." "Genetic recognition," Maeve murmured. "I've read about that, how family members can instinctively recognize genetic similarities even in strangers." A new thought struck Garrick with unsettling force. Wren, our genetic relationship, could it affect her health cousins having a child together? "First cousins once removed," Maeve corrected automatically, her scientific mind engaging despite the emotional tumult. "The risk is lower than for first cousins, but still." She took a deep breath. "Wren has had every standard medical screening. She's perfectly healthy, Garrick." Relief washed over him, followed quickly by a renewed sense of disorientation. "How? Do we tell her about this? Should we tell her?" "Not now," Maeve decided. "She's just learning to understand that you're her father. Adding this layer of complexity would only confuse her." "And us?" Garrick asked the question, layered with meanings neither of them was ready to fully articulate. "What does this mean for how we move forward?" Maeve returned to the table, slowly closing the family album. "I don't know," she admitted. "We're parents to a wonderful, healthy child. That doesn't change, but everything else." The sound of the front door opening interrupted their conversation, followed by the patter of small feet, and Wren's excited voice calling, "Mom, Dad, Mrs. Henderson, let me help bake cookies, and I brought some home." Garrick and Maeve exchanged a silent look of agreement. Their complicated discoveries would remain between them for now. Quickly, Garrick gathered the documents and photographs, returning them to the manila envelope as Wren bounded into the kitchen. "Hey, little bird," Maeve greeted her with forced cheerfulness. "Did you have fun at your playdate?" Wren nodded enthusiastically, proudly, presenting a small bag of misshapen but clearly lovingly made chocolate chip cookies. "I made this one specially for Dad," she announced carefully, extracting a particularly large specimen. "See, it has extra chips." Garrick accepted the offering with genuine warmth, pushing aside his tumultuous thoughts to focus on his daughter's delight. "It looks amazing," he assured her. "The best cookie I've ever seen." As they settled into the domestic rhythm of preparing dinner together, Wren setting the table with exaggerated care, Maeve checking on the lasagna in the oven, Garrick tossing the salad, the weight of their discovery seemed to recede temporarily. This was what mattered, Garrick thought, as he watched Wren carefully folding napkins into elaborate shapes she'd learned from a YouTube video. Not the tangled genetic connections or long-buried family secrets, but the present moment. This child, who somehow balanced Maeve's creativity with his methodical nature, creating something entirely new and wonderful. Later, after Wren had been tucked into bed with a story and promises of more time together, soon Garrick and Maeve sat on her small balcony, the evening air cooled by a gentle breeze. "What happens now?" Maeve asked, breaking the contemplative silence. That had settled between them. Garrick gazed out at the darkening sky, considering the question that encompassed so much more than just their genetic connection. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm starting to think that maybe it's okay not to know. That maybe life isn't supposed to be as orderly and planned as I always believed." Maeve studied him in the fading light. "That doesn't sound like the Garrick." Thorn, I remember. I'm not sure that person exists anymore, he said quietly. Or maybe he never really did. Maybe he was just a collection of expectations and assumptions built on a foundation that wasn't real to begin with. And who are you now? She asked the question, gentle but probing. Garrick considered this feeling the weight of the day's revelations, alongside the unexpected lightness that came with shedding long-held certainties. I'm Wren's father, he said finally. That's the part I'm sure of. The rest, I think I'm still figuring it out. As they sat together in companionable silence, watching stars emerge in the velvet sky, neither mentioned the undeniable fact that despite the complications of their shared bloodline, the connection between them remained, altered certainly, but perhaps ultimately strengthened by the truth they now carried together. What neither could have anticipated was that across town in the dimly lit study of the Thorn family home, Lorelei was making preparations of her own, preparations that would add yet another layer to the complex tapestry of truth and deception that had defined their family for generations. Nor could they have known that the mysterious forces that had brought them together, twice now, were not yet finished with the unlikely family they had created. 2 weeks after the revelation of their genetic connection, life had settled into an uneasy rhythm. Wren divided her time between Maeve's apartment and Garrick's house, adapting to the arrangement with the resilience of childhood. Garrick had taken a leave of absence from the architectural firm to focus on building his relationship with his newfound daughter, and Lorelei, against Seren's medical advice, had begun spending more time downstairs, insisting on being present for Wren's visits, despite her weakening condition. It was during one such visit that Garrick observed something unexpected. Wren sat cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by colored pencils and sketch paper, Maeve's influence clearly visible in her careful attention to detail as she drew. Across from her, seated in her usual armchair, Lorelei watched the child with an expression Garrick couldn't immediately place. "What are you drawing?" Lorelei asked, her voice softer than Garrick had heard it in years. Wren held up her work in progress without hesitation. "It's our family tree for school. See, there's Mom and Dad and me." She pointed to each rudimentary figure in turn. "And that's you, Grandma Lorelei. I gave you a purple dress because Mom says purple is a royal color." Lorelei leaned forward slightly, studying the drawing with genuine interest. "It's very good," she commented. "You have your mother's talent." "So that's what Dad says too," Wren replied, adding more detail to the figure representing Lorelei. "Mom's teaching me about shading. It's hard. The most worthwhile things usually are." Lorelei observed her gaze flickering briefly to Garrick, who stood unnoticed in the doorway. "Were you an artist too?" Wren asked, looking up from her drawing with curiosity. Something like regret crossed Lorelei's features. "No, dear. I wanted to be once. I used to paint watercolors when I was about your age. But my parents, your great-grandparents, didn't consider art a proper pursuit for a Thorn." Wren considered, this with a furrowed brow. "That's sad. Dad says I can be anything I want when I grow up." "Your father is wiser than I was at his age," Lorelei said quietly. "You should listen to him." The simple endorsement, so unlike his mother's usual critical assessments, caught Garrick by surprise. He stepped into the room, making his presence known. "Seren says it's time for your medication, Mother." Lorelei's expression hardened slightly, the vulnerability she'd shown with Wren receding behind her customary reserve. "Yes, of course. Don't let me interrupt your art, Wren. Perhaps you can show me the finished drawing later." As Lorelei left the room with Serene's assistance, Garrick took her place in the armchair, studying his daughter's drawing more closely. "That's really coming along," he observed. "Is this for Miss Parker's class?" Wren nodded, returning to her careful coloring. "We're learning about genealogy. That means family history," she added proudly, pronouncing the word with careful precision. "That's right," Garrick agreed, a complex mix of emotions stirring within him. How would he explain to this child someday that the family tree she was so carefully constructing contained branches even he hadn't known about until recently? "Mom said I should include Grandma Evelyn too, even though she's in heaven now." Wren continued, pointing to another figure with wings. "And she said there might be other relatives we don't know about yet, so I should leave some space." Garrick's chest tightened at Maeve's careful preparation for future revelations. That's smart planning, he managed. Grandma Lorelei seems sad sometimes. Wren observed unexpectedly changing subjects with the natural fluidity of childhood. Is it because she's sick? Partly, Garrick acknowledged, once again surprised by his daughter's perceptiveness. She's also sad about some mistakes she made a long time ago. Wren nodded sagely, as though this explanation confirmed her own observations. Mom says everybody makes mistakes. The important part is saying sorry and trying to do better. Mom is very wise, Garrick said momentarily, wondering when exactly Maeve had dispensed this particular piece of wisdom to their daughter. Had it been in reference to Lorelei, or to the complicated history between Maeve and Garrick himself? I think Grandma Lorelei is trying, Wren added, returning to her drawing. She looks at me different now than when I first came, like she's not scared anymore. The simple observation struck Garrick deeply. Had his mother been afraid of Wren, or perhaps afraid of what the child represented? The undeniable evidence of the connection between Garrick and Maeve, a connection Lorelei had tried so desperately to sever, before he could pursue this line. To have thought the doorbell rang, signaling Maeve's arrival to pick up Wren for her dance lesson. As Wren gathered her art supplies, Garrick went to answer the door, finding not just Maeve, but also a delivery person holding a large bakery box. Special delivery for Miss Wren Calloway Thorne, the young man announced, checking his clipboard. Birthday? Cake from Sweet Endings Bakery. Confused, Garrick accepted the box. There must be a mistake. Wren's birthday isn't for another 2 weeks. The order was specific, sir, for delivery today with this note. The deliveryman handed over a small envelope before tipping his hat and departing. Maeve raised her eyebrows questioningly as Garrick closed the door. A mystery cake. Apparently, he replied, opening the envelope to find a card written in his mother's distinctive handwriting, for Wren, to celebrate the day you came into our lives, even if it was 7 years late. With love, Grandma Lorelei. Stunned, Garrick handed the note to Maeve, who read it with widening eyes. This is unexpected, she said carefully. What's unexpected? Wren asked, appearing in the hallway with her backpack. It seems you have a cake, Garrick explained, still processing this unprecedented gesture from his mother. From Grandma Lorelei. Wren's face lit up. Really, can we eat it now? Maeve and Garrick exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. You'll be late for dance class, Maeve reminded her. But maybe we could all have some after if your dad doesn't mind us coming back. Here. Of course not, Garrick said quickly, grateful for Maeve's willingness to acknowledge the significance of his mother's gesture. I'll make coffee to go with it. And hot chocolate for me, Wren negotiated, already halfway out the door. With marshmallows, Garrick promised. After they left, he carried the cake box to the kitchen, where he found Seren preparing a tray of medication. Did you know about this? He asked, gesturing to the elaborate cake visible through the box's clear top, a castle design with Wren's name written in careful fondant lettering. Seren smiled. Your mother ordered it 3 days ago. She was very specific about the design. Said she remembered you being obsessed with castles at Wren's age. The mention of this shared trait between him and his daughter, something his mother had noticed and remembered, affected Garrick more deeply than he would have expected. Despite everything, Lorelei was trying to forge a connection with her granddaughter to acknowledge the place Wren had claimed in their family. How is she today? He asked, setting the cake in the refrigerator. Tired, Serene admitted, but determined. She insisted on sitting with Wren despite having a difficult night. Her newest test results aren't great, Garrick. The disease is progressing faster than we'd hoped. The reminder of his mother's mortality, a reality he'd been avoiding amid the other emotional upheavals of recent weeks, sobered him. Whatever Lorelei's past sins, whatever manipulations and deceptions she had orchestrated, she was still his mother, the woman who had raised him, if not the woman who had given birth to him. I should talk to her, he decided. He found Lorelei in her study, seated at her desk, with a leather-bound album open before her. She looked up as he entered, her expression guarded yet somehow expectant, as though she'd been waiting for this conversation. The cake was a kind gesture. Garrick began taking the chair opposite her. She's my granddaughter, Lorelei replied simply. I've missed 7 birthday celebrations. I thought I should start making up for lost time. The acknowledgement of her role in that loss, indirect but unmistakable, represented a significant shift from her previous defensive posture. Seren says your latest results aren't good. Garrick continued, watching her carefully. Lorelei closed the album with deliberate movements. The progression is accelerating. My neurologist gives me perhaps 6 months, though Seren thinks it might be less. The clinical detachment with which she delivered this prognosis was so typically Lorelei that Garrick almost smiled despite the gravity of the news. Even facing mortality, his mother maintained her composure. I want you to know, she continued, her voice less steady now, that I've made arrangements, legal arrangements for after I'm gone. Mother, we don't need to discuss this now. Deuce, she interrupted firmly, because it concerns Wren and Maeve. Garrick fell silent, sensing the importance of whatever his mother was about to reveal. I've established a trust for Wren's education, Lorelei explained, and amended my will to include provisions for Maeve as Wren's mother. The house will still come to you, of course, but there are other assets that will be divided differently than we previously discussed. The practical arrangements were so characteristic of his mother that Garrick wasn't surprised. What did surprise him was the implied acceptance of Maeve's permanent place in their lives. There's something else, Lorelei added, opening a drawer to remove a small leather-bound journal. I've been writing this for Wren. My memories, family stories she should know someday. The truth about why I kept her from you, explained in a way I hope she'll understand when she's older. She held out the journal, her hand trembling slightly. I'd like you to keep this to give to her when the time is right, when she's old enough, to understand that people can make terrible mistakes for what they believe are the right reasons. Garrick accepted the journal, moved despite himself by this vulnerable side of his usually stoic mother. She's already quite forgiving, he noted. She told me today that she thinks you're trying. Something like hope flickered across Lorelei's features. She's an extraordinary child. Yes, Garrick agreed. She is. A comfortable silence settled between them, not the complete reconciliation that might never come, but a tentative truce, built on their shared love for Wren. About Catherine Wilson, Garrick said, finally broaching the subject that had dominated his thoughts since discovering his biological origins. Did you know she was Maeve's aunt? Lorelei's expression grew more complex. Not at first. I suspected a connection. The resemblance was too striking to ignore. But it wasn't until Maeve mentioned her mother's maiden name years ago that I began to wonder. By then you two were already serious, and She trailed off, looking away. You were afraid of what it meant, Garrick finished for her. That's why you were so relieved when Maeve left. You thought she'd discovered the connection herself. I thought many things, none of them particularly rational in retrospect, Lorelei admitted. Fear rarely leads to clear thinking, Garrick. Remember that. Before he could respond, the sound of the front door opening announced Maeve and Wren's return. Their arrival seemed to energize Lorelei, who straightened in her chair with visible effort. We should join them, she said. I'd like to see Wren's reaction to her cake. As they made their way slowly to the kitchen, Lorelei leaning on her cane with one hand and Garrick's arm with the other, neither noticed the small envelope that had been slipped under the front door. It lay unattended in the entrance hall, its typed message waiting to disrupt the fragile peace they had begun to establish. Be careful who you trust. Some secrets are buried deeper than others. The celebration of cake and family togetherness would proceed undisturbed for now a moment. Of genuine connection, amid the complicated web of relationships, they were all still learning to navigate. But the anonymous warning with its ominous implications would eventually cast a shadow over their tentative new beginning, a reminder that not all secrets had yet come to light, and that some truths might prove more destructive than the lies that had preceded them. The envelope lay forgotten until the following morning, when Garrick, heading out for an early coffee with Maeve to discuss Wren's upcoming birthday party, nearly stepped on it. He picked it up absently, assuming it was a misdelivered bill or advertisement, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. It wasn't until he was seated across from Maeve at Millfield's only decent cafe that he remembered it, pulling it out as she detailed her ideas for Wren's celebration. What's that? Maeve asked, pausing in her enumeration of potential party themes. Not sure, Garrick replied, tearing open the unmarked envelope. Probably junk mail. But as he unfolded the single sheet of paper inside and read the typed message, "Be careful who you trust. Some secrets are buried deeper than others." A chill ran through him. "What is it?" Maeve pressed, noting his expression. Wordlessly, he handed her the note. She read it quickly, her brow furrowing. "This was delivered to your house when... I found it this morning, but it could have been slipped under the door any time yesterday," Garrick admitted. "We weren't exactly focused on checking for mail during the impromptu cake celebration." Maeve studied the note more carefully. No signature, no return address. Just a vague warning that could mean anything, or nothing. Or it could be related to everything that's happened recently, Garrick countered, lowering his voice despite the nearly empty cafe. "The timing seems significant." "You think someone knows about your adoption, about our connection?" Maeve asked, her voice equally hushed. Garrick ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration Maeve recognized from their years together. "I don't know what to think, but this feels deliberate, not random." "Could it be from your mother?" Maeve suggested. "Another attempt to manipulate the situation somehow." Garrick considered this but shook his head. "No, this isn't her style. She's been different lately. More open, more resigned, I guess. Besides, she's physically not capable of slipping something under the door without Seren noticing." They fell silent, each contemplating the implications of the mysterious message. Finally, Maeve folded the note and handed it back to Garrick. "Let's not let this derail us," she decided. "It could be a prank or a case of mistaken identity. We have Wren's birthday to plan." Grateful for her practical approach, Garrick pocketed the note and refocused on their original purpose. "You mentioned a castle theme, given her current obsession with medieval architecture that seems fitting." The conversation shifted back to cake flavors and guest lists, the anonymous warning temporarily set aside but not forgotten. By the time they parted an hour later, Maeve to her part-time job at the local gallery, Garrick to a meeting with Wren's teacher about an accelerated math program, they had agreed on a modestly sized celebration at Garrick's house with a professionally made castle cake and a scavenger hunt designed by Seren. It was only as Garrick pulled into the elementary school parking lot that another possibility regarding the note occurred to him, one that made his blood run cold. What if it wasn't about him and Maeve at all? What if someone knew something about Wren that they didn't? This unsettling thought lingered as he navigated the surprisingly complex politics of the parent-teacher conference, nodding at appropriate intervals as Ms. Parker detailed Wren's exceptional progress and social adjustment. Despite having known his daughter for less than a month, Garrick felt an irrational surge of pride at the teacher's glowing assessment. "She's quite remarkable, Mr. Thorne," Ms. Parker concluded, "especially considering the recent adjustments in her family situation. Children often struggle academically during major transitions, but Wren seems to thrive on change." "She gets that from her mother," Garrick responded automatically, then paused, struck by the irony of attributing traits to genetic inheritance when his own understanding of his biological origins was so recently upended. Miss Parker smiled sympathetically, misinterpreting his hesitation. "It must be a significant adjustment for you as well, discovering you have a daughter. If Wren ever needs additional support, our school counselor is excellent with family transitions." "Thank you," Garrick said sincerely. "But between Maeve, Ms. Calloway and myself, I think we're managing to provide a stable environment despite the unconventional circumstances." As he left the school, Garrick found himself reflecting on the phrase, unconventional circumstances. An almost comical understatement. For the Byzantine complexity of their situation, a mother who had hidden his daughter's existence, a biological connection to his child's mother, he'd never suspected, and now an anonymous warning that hinted at even deeper secrets. Lost in these thoughts, he almost didn't notice the silver sedan that pulled away from the curb as he exited the school parking lot, maintaining a discreet distance behind his own vehicle, all the way back to the Thorne house. At home he found his mother and Serene in the sunroom, Lorelei uncharacteristically dressed in casual clothes, silk pajamas covered by a cashmere robe, as she leafed through a stack of what appeared to be old photographs. "How was the teacher meeting?" Seren asked, adjusting Lorelei's medication pump. Positive, Garrick replied, his attention drawn to the photographs. What are you looking at, Mother? Lorelei glanced up, something almost furtive in her expression. Just organizing some old family photos for Wren. Her interest in the family tree project has inspired me to put together a proper album for her. Garrick moved closer, noting that many of the images featured his father, William Thorne in his prime before the heart attack that had claimed him 7 years ago. In one, William stood proudly beside a teenage Garrick at a rowing competition, his hand resting on his son's shoulder with obvious pride. He would have adored Wren, Lorelei said softly, following Garrick's gaze. Your father always wanted grandchildren. The wistfulness in her tone caught Garrick off guard. His relationship with his father had been less complicated than with Lorelei. William had been stern but fair, demanding excellence, but quick to acknowledge achievement. Looking back with his new knowledge, Garrick wondered if his adoption had influenced their relationship in ways he hadn't recognized at the time. Did he ever want to tell me? Garrick asked suddenly. About being adopted? Lorelei's hands stilled over the photographs. Many times, she admitted. Especially when you were a teenager asking about family medical history for some school project. He thought you had a right to know. I was the one who insisted we maintain the secret. Why? Garrick pressed, an old hurt rising despite his attempt to approach the conversation rationally. Were you ashamed, afraid I'd somehow feel less yours? Both, Lorelei acknowledged with surprising candor. And something more complicated. I had convinced myself that protecting you from that knowledge was an act of love. That certainty about your identity was more important than biological truth. Seren discreetly excused herself, sensing the private nature of the conversation. As she left, Garrick took her vacated seat across from his mother. And now, he asked, what do you believe now? Lorelei met his gaze directly. That I was wrong. That in trying to control your narrative, I denied. Are you agency over your own life? It's the same mistake I made with Maeve and Wren. Different circumstances, same fundamental error. The admission, more forthright than anything Garrick could remember from his mother, momentarily silenced him. In the space that followed, he remembered the note in his pocket. Mother, he began carefully, have you received any strange messages recently? Notes, calls, anything unusual? Lorelei's expression shifted subtly. Why do you ask? Rather than answering directly, Garrick removed the anonymous note from his pocket and placed it before her. This was slipped under our door sometime yesterday. I found it this morning. Lorelei read the message, her complexion paling slightly beneath her carefully applied makeup. No, she said finally, I haven't received anything similar, but what? Garrick prompted when she hesitated. There have been some strange calls, hang-ups mostly. Serene mentioned them last week, said someone had called the house line several times but never spoke when she answered. A prickle of unease traveled down Garrick's spine. Do you think it's related to Wren, to Maeve coming back into our lives? Lorelei folded the note carefully, her movements deliberate. It could be, she admitted, or it could be related to other matters. What other matters? Garrick pressed, sensing his mother's evasion. Lorelei sighed suddenly, looking every one of her 62 years. Your father's business dealings weren't always as straightforward as you might have believed. There were competitors who held grudges, former associates who felt cheated. Nothing criminal, she added hastily, but not everything was as above board as the Thorne family image suggested. This was new information, another layer of family secrets being peeled back to reveal unexpected truths. You think this could be related to my father's business after all these years? Unlikely, Lorelei conceded, but not impossible. William was careful about his documentation, but in his final months as his health failed, he became concerned about certain partnerships. He spoke of regrets of correcting past mistakes. Garrick struggled to reconcile this image of his father, harboring business regrets, potentially cutting ethical corners, with the principled man he'd known. But then, hadn't he recently learned that much of what he'd believed about his family was constructed rather than authentic? There's something else, Lorelei added, her voice dropping to near a whisper. Something I haven't told anyone, not even your father knew. It concerns Catherine, your birth mother. Garrick leaned forward, his heart pounding. What about her? She tried to find you. Lorelei confessed, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed her robe. When you were 16, she sent a letter asking if you might be open to meeting her someday. I intercepted it, returned it with a note saying you weren't interested in contact. The revelation hit Garrick like a physical blow. You had no... Right, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. I know that now. Lorelei acknowledged, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. But at the time I was terrified. You were doing so well. Captain of the debate team, straight as early acceptance to Yale. I convinced myself that introducing such emotional upheaval would jeopardize everything you'd worked for. So you made another choice for me, Garrick said bitterly, just like with Maeve and Wren. Yes, Lorelei admitted, a pattern I recognized too late to correct properly. Garrick stood abruptly, needing physical distance from his mother's confessions. Did she try again after that first attempt? Lorelei nodded slowly. Once more about 5 years later. By then she was already ill. The letter mentioned she didn't have much time left and wanted to see you just once before. She trailed off, unable to complete the sentence. And you denied her that too. Garrick finished, the weight of missed chances pressing on his chest. His birth mother had died, never knowing him, never seeing the man he'd become, all because of Lorelei's misguided protectiveness. I thought I was shielding you, Lorelei said softly. I see now I was only shielding myself from the fear of losing you to a woman who had a biological claim I could never match. The raw honesty of her admission diffused some of Garrick's anger, replacing it with a complicated grief for opportunities forever lost. He paced the sunroom, trying to process this latest revelation alongside everything else he'd learned in recent weeks. The note, he said, suddenly returning to their original topic. Do you think it could be related to this to Catherine? Lorelei considered the possibility. I don't see how. Catherine has been gone for 8 years and very few people knew of your adoption. It was handled privately with sealed records. But someone clearly knows something, Garrick insisted. The timing can't be coincidental. Maeve returns with Wren, I discover I'm adopted. We learn Catherine was Maeve's aunt, and now this warning appears. Before Lorelei could respond, Garrick's phone chimed with a text from Maeve. Coming by with, Wren in an hour. She wants to show you her art project from school. Maeve and Wren are coming over, he informed his mother, pocketing his phone. This conversation isn't finished, but it needs to pause. Lorelei nodded, gathering the scattered photographs with trembling hands. Of course, I'll be in my room. I find myself quite tired suddenly. As she stood with visible effort, Garrick fought the conflicting impulses to assist her and to maintain his emotional distance. Compassion won out, and he offered his arm to help her to the staircase where Seren waited to take over. Garrick, Lorelei said as they reached the stairs. Be careful. Whatever that note means, there's genuine hostility behind it. The Thorne family has always had its share of enemies, justified or not. The warning coming from his usually stoic mother carried weight he couldn't dismiss. As he watched her slow ascent up the stairs, leaning heavily on Seren for support, Garrick was struck by how diminished she appeared, physically weakened by disease, emotionally vulnerable in ways he'd never witnessed before. He returned to the sunroom to tidy the remaining photographs, his mind churning with questions without answers. As he collected the scattered images, one slipped from the stack, a photograph he didn't recall seeing before. It showed a young Lorelei with his father William, alongside another couple Garrick didn't recognize. All four were dressed formally, the men in tuxedos, the women in evening gowns, standing before what appeared to be a charity gala backdrop. Turning the photograph over, Garrick found a handwritten notation, William and Lorelei Thorne with Edward, and Sophia Wilson, Boston Symphony Benefit, 1989, Wilson, Catherine's surname. These must be her parents, Garrick realized, his biological grandparents, and judging by the date, this was taken just a year before his birth. The existence of this photograph contradicted Lorelei's narrative about the private, confidential adoption. If his parents had known Catherine's family socially, the adoption hadn't been the anonymous transaction she'd described. which meant there were still more secrets Lorelei hadn't revealed, secrets that might explain the ominous warning, now burning a hole in his pocket. As the doorbell announced Maeve and Wren's arrival, Garrick slipped the photograph into his own pocket, determined to uncover the complete truth about his origins, no matter what shadows might emerge from the family's carefully guarded past. "It's definitely them," Maeve confirmed, studying the photograph Garrick had shown her after Wren had gone to sleep in the guest room. "Edward and Sophia Wilson, my grandparents." They sat at the kitchen table, mugs of tea growing cold between them as they pieced together the implications of this latest discovery. "My mother mentioned them occasionally," Maeve continued. "Very wealthy, very proper Boston society people. They essentially disowned my Aunt Catherine when she got pregnant out of wedlock. Mom always said it broke Catherine's heart. And apparently, Catherine was pregnant with me," Garrick said, still struggling to reconcile this reality with his sense of self. "But here are my parents, the Thorns, socializing with the Wilsons a year before I was born. It doesn't add up." Maeve traced the outline of the figures in the photograph. What if it wasn't as simple as a private adoption between strangers? What if your parents actually knew my grandparents socially? What if they knew Catherine was pregnant before arranging to adopt you? The possibility sent an uncomfortable chill down Garrick's spine. That would mean my mother has been lying about more than just intercepting Catherine's letters. It would mean the entire adoption story she told me was fabricated. Or at least heavily edited, Maeve suggested, more measured in her assessment. People often simplify complicated situations, especially when explaining them to their children. Garrick ran his fingers through his hair, a gesture of frustration that Maeve remembered well from their time together. "So what's the truth? Were my parents friends with your grandparents? Did they somehow arrange to adopt Catherine's baby, their friend's grandchild, when she got pregnant?" "It would explain some things," Maeve acknowledged. "Like why Catherine tried to contact you years later. If she knew exactly who had adopted her child, it would have been easier to find you." The pieces were beginning to align in Garrick's mind, forming a picture that was both more logical and more disturbing than Lorelei's simplified narrative. "We need to know more," he decided. "My mother isn't telling the whole story, and with her health declining, we might not have much time to get the truth from her." Maeve nodded, her expression troubled. "And there's still that warning note to consider. Be careful who you trust. What if it's related to all this? What if someone knows something about your adoption that even you don't know?" Before Garrick could respond, a small voice came from the doorway. "Dad, I had a bad dream." They both turned to see Wren standing there in her pajamas, clutching the stuffed dragon Garrick had given her the previous week. Her hair was tousled from sleep, her eyes heavy-lidded, but clearly distressed. "Hey, sweetheart," Garrick said immediately, setting aside the photograph as he moved to comfort his daughter. "Do you want to talk about it?" Wren nodded, allowing herself to be lifted onto his lap at the table. "There was a man with a scary voice," she explained, her small fingers playing with the dragon's wings. "He said he was going to take me away because I didn't belong here." Garrick exchanged an alarmed glance with Maeve over Wren's head. The nightmare's content was unsettlingly similar to their current concerns. "It was just a dream," Maeve assured her, reaching across to smooth Wren's tangled hair. "No one is taking you anywhere. You belong with us, with your dad and me." "And Grandma Lorelei?" Wren asked, her voice small. "Yes," Garrick confirmed, surprised by the child's inclusion of his mother. "With all of us. This is your family, Wren." The simple declaration seemed to comfort her, and she relaxed against his chest. "Can I have some water?" As Maeve went to fetch a glass, Garrick noticed Wren's gaze fixed on the photograph they'd hastily set aside. "Who are those people with Grandma Lorelei?" she asked, her natural curiosity overtaking her lingering fear. Garrick hesitated, unsure how to explain the complex reality to a 7-year-old. "They're people your grandma and grandpa knew a long time ago." "They look like Mum's pictures," Wren observed with the uncanny perceptiveness that continued to surprise Garrick. "The ones in the album with the blue cover," Maeve returned with the water, catching the end of Wren's comment. "Which pictures, little bird?" "The fancy people in the old photos. Mum has the same people in her album, but they look older." Wren accepted the water, taking a small sip. She said they're my great-grandparents. Another piece of the puzzle slotted into place. If Wren recognized Edward and Sophia Wilson from photos in Maeve's possession, it confirmed they were indeed the same people. Catherine's parents, Maeve's grandparents, and apparently social acquaintances of the Thorns. You have a good memory. Garrick praised her, exchanging another significant look with Maeve. Think you can get back to sleep now? It's still a few hours until morning. Wren considered this, then nodded. Will you read me another chapter of my castle book? Of course, he agreed, grateful for the simple request that offered temporary escape from the complex web of family secrets they were unraveling. After Wren had been resettled in the guest room with another chapter of her beloved book about medieval architecture, Garrick rejoined Maeve in the kitchen. This is getting more complicated by the hour, he observed, keeping his voice low. We need to get the full story from my mother before... The sharp ring of the doorbell interrupted him. They both froze, exchanging confused glances. It's almost midnight, Maeve whispered. Who would be calling at this hour? Stay here, Garrick instructed, moving cautiously toward the front hall. The peephole revealed a middle-aged man in a rumpled suit standing on the porch, his expression grim beneath the porch light. Garrick didn't recognize him, but something about his stance, professional, determined, triggered a wary response. Who is it? He called through the door. Mr. Thorne. My name is Malcolm Reed. I'm a private investigator. I need to speak with you regarding Catherine Wilson. The man's voice was steady, authoritative. It's urgent. Garrick hesitated, torn between caution and the desperate need for answers about his biological mother. Finally, he opened the door, but kept the security chain engaged. It's midnight, he pointed out. This couldn't wait until morning. The man, Reed, looked apologetic but determined. I've been trying to locate you for weeks. I was hired by Catherine Wilson before her death to deliver certain information to you when specific conditions were met. Those conditions have now been satisfied. What conditions? Garrick demanded, suspicion warring with curiosity. The return of her daughter to Millfield, Reed stated simply. Maeve Calloway's arrival triggered a series of protocols Catherine established years ago. Stunned, Garrick unlatched the chain and opened the door wider. You knew Maeve would come. But how could Catherine possibly have predicted that? Reed reached inside his jacket, producing a sealed envelope with Garrick's name written on it in unfamiliar handwriting. All the answers you seek are in here, Mr. Thorne. Catherine Wilson was a remarkable woman who foresaw more than anyone gave her credit for. As Garrick accepted the envelope, Reed added, A word of warning, sir. The contents will likely upend what you think you know about your family, and there are those who would prefer this information remain buried. Like whoever sent the warning note, Garrick muttered more to himself than Reed. The investigator's eyes narrowed. You received a warning when... Yesterday. Something about being careful who I trust. Reed nodded grimly. Then I'm not too late. Read the letter, Mr. Thorne. Catherine wanted you to know the truth, all of it. About your birth, about why she gave you up, and about the arrangement between the Wilsons and the Thorns that has shaped both your life and Maeve's. With that cryptic statement, he turned to leave, pausing only to add, My contact information is in the envelope. Call me when you've read it, you'll have questions. Garrick stood in the doorway, the envelope heavy in his hands, watching as Reed disappeared into a nondescript sedan parked at the curb. When he finally closed the door and returned to the kitchen, he found not only Maeve waiting, but also Seren, who had apparently come downstairs during the exchange. Who was that? Maeve asked, eyeing the envelope in his hands. A private investigator, Garrick explained, still processing the surreal encounter. Apparently hired by Catherine, my birth mother, before she died. Serene's expression shifted, from curiosity to concern. I should wake Mrs. Thorne. She needs to be part of this conversation. No, Garrick decided firmly. Whatever is in this envelope, I want to read it first, without my mother's interpretations or explanations. She's had her chance to tell me the truth, and she's chosen not to. As he broke the seal on the envelope, Garrick couldn't shake the feeling that he was crossing a threshold from which there was no return, that the contents of Catherine Wilson's letter would irrevocably alter not just his understanding of the past, but the shape of his family's future. The kitchen was silent except for the occasional turning of pages as Garrick read through the contents of Catherine Wilson's envelope. Inside had been a 10-page handwritten letter, several legal documents, and a small key similar to the one that had opened Lorelei's wall safe. Maeve sat across from him, respectfully quiet but visibly anxious, while Seren had discreetly withdrawn to check on Lorelei, promising to return if needed. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, Garrick sat down. The last page, his expression unreadable. "Well," Maeve prompted gently. "What did she say?" Garrick's laugh was hollow, devoid of humor. "It's worse than we imagined. So much worse." He pushed the letter toward her, his hand trembling slightly. Catherine Wilson wasn't just some young artist who got pregnant and gave her baby up for adoption. She was systematically manipulated by both our families. Maeve's brow furrowed as she began to read, her expression shifting from confusion to shock as she progressed through Catherine's account. According to the letter, Catherine had indeed been a promising art student when she became involved with a young businessman named William Thorne, Garrick's adoptive father. Their affair had been brief but passionate ending when William reconciled with his wife Lorelei after a temporary separation. When Catherine discovered she was pregnant, she approached William discreetly, wanting nothing but acknowledgement and minimal support for their child. Instead, she found herself facing the combined pressure of both the Thorne and Wilson families, her parents being longtime business associates of the Thornes. The solution they engineered was coldly pragmatic. Catherine would carry the pregnancy to term, but relinquish all rights to the child. William and Lorelei would adopt the baby, presenting it to society as their own. Catherine would receive a substantial financial settlement and the promise of connections to advance her art career. The adoption would be processed through private channels with records sealed and all parties sworn to secrecy. "My God," Maeve whispered as she finished reading. "So your adoptive father was actually your biological father all along, and Catherine was pressured to give you up to protect both families' reputations." "Apparently," Garrick confirmed, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "According to Catherine, Lorelei couldn't have children. Her pregnancies all ended in miscarriages, but she was obsessed with providing William an heir. When she learned about Catherine's pregnancy, she saw an opportunity to solve both problems at once: secure a biological child for William and eliminate the evidence of his infidelity." "And my grandparents went along with this?" Maeve asked, horrified. "They forced their own daughter to give up her child." "The Wilsons were apparently facing financial ruin at the time," Garrick explained, referencing details from Catherine's letter. "William Thorne bailed them out in exchange for their cooperation in handling the Catherine situation. They essentially sold their grandchild, me, to save their social standing and financial security." Maeve shook her head in disbelief. "This is monstrous, Garrick. All these people conspiring to separate a mother from her child, to rewrite your entire existence." "And the deception continued," Garrick added bitterly. "Catherine writes that when she tried to contact me years later, Lorelei threatened to expose old secrets that would damage both the Wilson and Thorne families. Secrets beyond just my parentage." "What kind of secrets?" "She doesn't specify in the letter. She says that information is in a safety deposit box at Millfield National Bank." Garrick held up the small key that had accompanied the letter. "Apparently this opens it." Maeve processed this information, her artist's eye noting details Garrick had missed in his emotional turmoil. "The handwriting," she said suddenly. "The date on the letter. Garrick, Catherine wrote this just weeks before she died. She knew she was terminal, but made arrangements for you to receive this only if I returned to Millfield with Wren." "Why?" Garrick rubbed his temples, trying to make sense of Catherine's final machinations. "She says she eventually learned about us from your mother. She knew we had a child together, a child I wasn't aware of because Lorelei had intercepted your communications." She saw the pattern repeating, Maeve realized. Lorelei separating a child from their parent, just as she'd helped separate Catherine from you. Catherine writes that she tried to warn your mother about Lorelei's manipulations, but by then your mother was already ill. She hoped that someday you would return to Millfield with Wren, and the truth could finally come out. Garrick's voice grew hoarse with emotion. She wanted to protect our daughter from the same web of lies that trapped us all. The weight of these revelations pressed down on them both, the tangled history of lies and manipulations that had shaped their lives, without their knowledge or consent. "What happens now?" Maeve asked quietly. Before Garrick could answer, they heard the unmistakable sound of shattering glass from upstairs, followed by Serene's alarmed voice calling Garrick's name. They raced up the stairs to find Lorelei's bedroom. Door opened, Serene kneeling beside the elderly woman, who lay crumpled on the floor surrounded by broken glass from a fallen water pitcher. Blood from a cut on her hand stained the sleeve of her silk robe. "She was trying to get to the phone," Serene explained breathlessly as Garrick knelt beside his mother. "I told her to wait for me to help, but she insisted it was urgent." Lorelei's eyes fluttered open, focusing on Garrick with surprising clarity, despite her weakened state. "He was here, wasn't he?" she whispered. "Catherine's investigator." Garrick nodded, too concerned with her physical condition to question how she knew about Reed. "Mother, don't try to move. We need to bandage your hand." "No time," Lorelei insisted, her voice stronger than seemed possible given her frail appearance. "You read her letter. You know about William." "Yes," Garrick confirmed, his tone hardening slightly despite his concern. "I know you've been lying to me my entire life. That father was actually my biological father, that Catherine was coerced into giving me up." Lorelei closed her eyes briefly, pain crossing her features that seemed unrelated to her physical injuries. "Not coerced," she corrected weakly. "Threatened. I threatened her, Garrick. William didn't know the extent of it. He thought she'd agreed willingly to the arrangement." Maeve, who had been helping Serene gather first aid supplies, paused at this confession. "You threatened Catherine with what?" Lorelei's gaze shifted to Maeve, recognition and something like resignation in her expression. "You look so much like her. I knew the moment Garrick brought you home years ago. The same eyes, the same spirit." "Mother," Garrick pressed, "what did you threaten Catherine with?" Lorelei's breathing had become more labored concerning Serene, who began checking her vital signs. "The safety deposit box," Lorelei managed. Catherine knew what it contained. Evidence of what William and Edward Wilson had done. The real reason the Wilsons nearly lost everything. "Which was what?" Garrick demanded, struggling to balance his anger with concern for his mother's deteriorating condition. "Fraud," Lorelei whispered. "Securities fraud. They would have gone to prison. Both families would have been ruined. I discovered it accidentally. Used it to get what I wanted. A child for William, an heir for the Thorne name." The admission hung in the air, the final piece of a puzzle 34 years in the making. "Garrick," Serene interrupted urgently. "Her blood pressure is dangerously high. We need to get her to a hospital." Reality reasserted itself as Garrick snapped into action, helping Serene stabilize his mother, while Maeve called for an ambulance. Within minutes, paramedics arrived, efficiently transferring Lorelei to a stretcher, her fragile form nearly lost beneath the emergency blankets. "I'm sorry," Lorelei whispered to Garrick as they prepared to move her. "For everything. The lies. Other manipulations. I thought I was protecting our family, our legacy." Despite everything he'd learned, despite the anger and betrayal churning within him, Garrick found himself taking his mother's frail hand. "Save your strength," he told her, his voice gentler than he'd intended. "We'll talk when you're stable." As the paramedics wheeled Lorelei toward the stairs, Garrick turned to find Wren standing in the hallway, wide-eyed and frightened, clutching her stuffed dragon. "Is Grandma Lorelei going to die?" she asked, her small voice trembling. Garrick knelt to her level, finding no words to sugarcoat the gravity of the situation. "The doctors are going to do everything they can to help her," he said honestly. "She's very sick, but she's also very strong." Wren nodded, processing this with her usual solemnity. Then, surprising both Garrick and Maeve, she approached the stretcher before the paramedics could begin their descent. "Grandma," she said clearly, "please get better. I still need to show you my finished family tree." Lorelei's eyes opened, focusing with effort on the child. "I would like that very much," she managed, her voice barely audible. As the paramedics carefully navigated the stretcher down the stairs, Garrick found himself standing between Maeve and Wren, the three of them forming an unlikely unit amid the chaos of medical equipment and urgent voices. "You should go with her," Maeve said softly. "Wren and I will follow in my car." Garrick nodded, grateful for her understanding. The safety deposit box, he remembered suddenly. Catherine's key. After the hospital. "One thing at a time," Maeve counseled, her hand finding his, in a gesture of support that transcended their complicated history. "Your mother needs you now. The secrets have waited 34 years. They can wait a few more hours." As Garrick followed the ambulance in his car, his mind raced with the implications of all he'd learned. His father, the man he'd respected and mourned, had not only been his biological father all along, but had participated in a conspiracy to separate him from his birth mother. His mother, controlling and manipulative as she'd always been, had orchestrated the entire deception through blackmail and threats. And Catherine Wilson, the aunt of the woman he'd loved, the mother he'd never known, had reached across time and beyond death to finally reveal the truth, setting in motion a reckoning that had been decades in the making. What remained to be seen was whether this reckoning would finally break the cycle of secrecy and manipulation that had defined the Thorne family for generations, or whether some patterns were too deeply ingrained to ever truly change. 3 weeks later, Garrick stood in Wren's bedroom at Maeve's apartment, helping his daughter hang the elaborate family tree she'd created for her school project. The tree was notably different from her original draft, incorporating the complicated reality of their family's history, as filtered through a 7-year-old's understanding. "I made Catherine's branch with sparkly gold because Mom says she was an artist who loved bright colors," Wren explained, pointing to the section representing Garrick's birth mother. "And I put Grandpa William twice, once here and once here, because he was both kinds of dad to you." "Both kinds of dad," Garrick repeated, marveling at his daughter's capacity to simplify the complex web of relationships that had taken him weeks to process. "That's a good way to put it." The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of hospital visits, legal consultations, and emotional reckonings. Lorelei had survived her health crisis, but emerged significantly weakened, now requiring round-the-clock medical care at a rehabilitation facility. The contents of Catherine's safety deposit box had confirmed everything in her letter and added layers of documentation, financial records, proving the fraud William Thorne and Edward Wilson had committed, correspondence between the families orchestrating Catherine's pregnancy and Garrick's adoption, even photographs of a visibly pregnant Catherine looking young and vulnerable beside the imposing figures of both sets of parents. Most surprisingly, the box had contained a series of letters Catherine had written to Garrick throughout his childhood and adolescence. Letters she'd never sent, knowing they would be intercepted, but had preserved as a record of her enduring connection to the son she'd been forced to relinquish. "Is this right?" Wren asked, distracting Garrick from his reflections. She pointed to a section where she'd added Lorelei to the tree connected to him with a dotted line labeled "Raised Me," rather than the solid line she'd used to connect Catherine. "It's perfect," Garrick assured her, touched by the child's intuitive understanding of the different but equally significant roles these women had played in his life. "You've done an amazing job with this, Wren." The doorbell rang, announcing the arrival of Seren, who had agreed to watch Wren while Garrick and Maeve visited Lorelei at the rehabilitation center. It was to be their first joint visit since Lorelei's hospitalization, a tentative step toward whatever new family dynamic might emerge from the ashes of decades of deception. As they drove to the facility, Maeve broached the subject they'd been carefully navigating in recent days. "Have you decided what to do about the fraud evidence?" she asked. "Malcolm Reed says the statute of limitations hasn't expired technically." Garrick nodded, his hands tightening slightly on the steering wheel. "I've decided not to pursue it. William and Edward are both dead. The only people who would suffer now would be peripheral to the original crimes, shareholders, employees of companies long since restructured or dissolved. And Lorelei," Maeve added softly. "Yes," Garrick acknowledged. "Despite everything, I can't bring myself to destroy what remains of her life. She's lost so much already. Her health, her independence, her carefully constructed narrative of our family." Some would say she deserves consequences, Maeve observed, though her tone held no judgment. Living with the truth is her consequence, Garrick replied. Knowing that I know everything, that the manipulations and lies have all been exposed. For someone like my mother, that's punishment enough. They fell silent as they pulled into the rehabilitation center's parking lot, each lost in thought about the complicated woman they were about to visit. Lorelei's private room was flooded with afternoon sunlight, transforming the institutional space into something almost welcoming. She sat in a wheelchair by the window, a blanket draped across her legs. Despite the warmth of the day, her once commanding presence diminished, but not entirely extinguished. "You came together," she observed. As they entered, her gaze moving between them, with the sharpness that illness had not completely dulled. "We did," Garrick confirmed, taking the chair opposite her while Maeve settled on the small sofa nearby. "How is Wren?" Lorelei asked, genuine interest evident in her voice. "Finishing her family tree project," Maeve answered. "She's found creative ways to represent our unique situation." A ghost of a smile touched Lorelei's lips. "She's a remarkable child, resilient in ways I never was." The admission, so at odds with the proud, unbending woman Garrick had known all his life, created an opening for the conversation they needed to have. "I've been to the bank," Garrick said, watching his mother's expression carefully. "I've seen Catherine's documentation. All of it." Lorelei's hands trembled slightly in her lap, but she met his gaze directly. "And now you know the worst of me," she said quietly. "The lengths I went to, the people I hurt, all to create the family I thought we needed to be. What I don't understand," Maeve interjected gently, "is why. Why not simply acknowledge Garrick as William's son with Catherine? Why the elaborate deception that caused so much pain to everyone involved?" Lorelei's gaze drifted to the window where the gardens below offered a view of normal life continuing. Visitors walking with patient staff, moving between buildings, all unaware of the decades of secrets being unraveled in the room above them. "You have to understand the world we lived in," she began, her voice taking on a reflective quality. "Appearances were everything. The Thorne family reputation was built on a foundation of respectability stretching back generations. If William had acknowledged an illegitimate child, especially during a time when he was being considered for a position on the state finance board. So it was about social standing, Garrick concluded, about maintaining the facade of the perfect family." "Initially, yes," Lorelei admitted, "but then when I held you for the first time—" Her voice faltered, emotion briefly overwhelming her carefully maintained composure. "You became mine, Garrick, not just in name or public perception, but in my heart. The deception that began as preservation of our social standing became something more personal, preservation of my role as your mother, the only mother you would know." "At Catherine's expense," Maeve pointed out, though her tone remained gentle. "Yes," Lorelei acknowledged, "at terrible expense to Catherine, who loved you from the moment she knew you existed. I recognized that love in her eyes whenever she tried to make contact over the years. The same love I felt for you, Garrick. It made me defensive, possessive, afraid. And when Maeve came into my life," Garrick prompted. When history seemed to be repeating itself, Lorelei's gaze shifted to Maeve, something like understanding passing between the women. "I saw Catherine in you, not just the physical resemblance, but the same independent spirit, the same artistic passion. When I learned you were pregnant, all I could think was, here it comes again, another Wilson woman carrying a Thorne child, another scandal waiting to erupt." "So you made sure I never knew," Garrick said, the hurt still evident in his voice despite weeks of processing. "You kept my own daughter from me for 7 years. I can't justify it," Lorelei said simply. "I can only say that patterns established over decades are difficult to break. I did what I had always done, controlled the narrative, eliminated threats, to the family structure as I believed it should be." She paused, gathering herself. "I was wrong, terribly, unforgivably wrong." The straightforward admission, devoid of the rationalizations and deflections that had characterized Lorelei's previous attempts at explanation, created a shift in the room's atmosphere. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Garrick said honestly. "Not yet. Maybe not ever completely, but I'm trying to understand. And I want Wren to know her grandmother, the real woman behind the manipulations and control. Lorelei's eyes filled with tears, an unprecedented display of vulnerability. I would like that very much, she whispered. However much time I have left, I want to spend it being honest, being better. Maeve, who had been watching this exchange with careful attention, leaned forward. Speaking of honesty, there's something we need to tell you. Something we've decided about our family going forward. Lorelei looked between them, wariness mingling with curiosity. Yes, Wren needs stability, Garrick explained. She needs both her parents present in her life, not split between two households. We're buying a house together, Maeve continued, not as a couple exactly, but as co-parents committed to raising our daughter in a unified environment. Understanding dawned in Lorelei's expression. You're creating a new kind of family, she observed, unconventional but centered around what Wren needs rather than what tradition dictates. Exactly, Garrick confirmed, somewhat surprised by his mother's perceptiveness. We're breaking the cycle, Mother. No more secrets, no more manipulations, no more sacrificing emotional truth for the sake of appearances. It won't be easy, Lorelei warned, though, without her usual critical edge. Society still has expectations, still judges arrangements that don't fit the traditional mold. We're not concerned with society's expectations, Maeve said firmly. Only with creating a healthy environment for Wren and for ourselves. Lorelei studied them both, something like admiration briefly illuminating her features. You're braver than I ever was, she acknowledged, than either of your families ever were. The visit continued for another hour, the conversation gradually shifting to more practical matters. Lorelei's treatment plan, the arrangements for her eventual return home with full-time nursing care, Wren's upcoming birthday celebration. By the time Garrick and Maeve prepared to leave, a tenuous new understanding had begun to form between the three adults, a foundation for whatever came next. As they stood to depart, Lorelei reached for Garrick's hand. I saved something for you, she said. In the safe behind the lighthouse painting, there's a small blue box I didn't show you before. It contains letters from Catherine that I intercepted, but couldn't bring myself to destroy. You should have them now. The admission of this final deception, freely offered without prompting, represented a shift that Garrick couldn't yet fully process. Thank you, he said simply. I'll look for them. Outside in the corridor, as they walked toward the elevator, Maeve slipped her hand into Garrick's, not romantically, but in the way of old friends who had weathered a storm together. Are you okay? She asked softly. Garrick considered the question, feeling the weight and complexity of everything they had learned and everything that still lay ahead. I don't know, he admitted, but I think I will be eventually. We all will be. As they drove back to collect Wren, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the town of Millfield, the place where so many secrets had been buried and were now finally coming to light. The house they had put an offer on lay just ahead, a Victorian not unlike the Thorne family home, but smaller, more manageable, unburdened by generations of hidden truths. Do you think we're doing the right thing? Maeve asked, as they pulled into the driveway of her apartment. This unconventional family we're creating. Garrick thought of Wren, her resilience, her perceptiveness, her capacity for adaptation and forgiveness. He thought of Catherine Wilson, who had reached across time to ensure that truth would eventually prevail. He thought of Lorelei, who for all her flaws was attempting, however late, to make amends for the patterns of deception she had perpetuated. I think we're creating something honest, he said finally. And after generations of lies, that's the most important thing we can give Wren and ourselves. Inside they found Wren proudly displaying her completed family tree to Seren, the complex branches and connections rendered in a child's colorful art supplies, but capturing a truth that legal documents and secret letters had only begun to express. That family was not defined by biology alone or by social conventions, but by the connections people chose to nurture and sustain, despite obstacles and uncertainties. As Wren ran to greet them, her face alight with pride in her creation, Garrick felt something settle within him, not forgiveness exactly, nor complete healing, but the beginnings of acceptance. The past could not be changed, but the future remained. Unwritten, a blank page where new patterns could be established, and old wounds, if not fully healed, could at least begin to scar over. "Dad, Mom, look," Wren exclaimed, holding up her family tree. "I added everyone, even the complicated parts. Miss Parker says it's the most interesting family tree she's ever seen." Garrick and Maeve exchanged glances over their daughter's head a moment, of perfect understanding passing between them. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever complications might arise from their unusual arrangement, they were united in their commitment to honesty, to healing, to creating a family defined by love rather than deception. And in that moment, surrounded by the colorful representation of their intertwined histories, Garrick knew that they had already begun to break the cycle that had entrapped generations before them, not through dramatic gestures or public reckonings, but through the quiet daily choice to face truth together, to embrace complexity rather than hide from it, to build their future on a foundation of authenticity rather than appearance. It was enough. It was a beginning,